Imagine walking into a medieval tavern. The air is thick with smoke, the chatter of peasants arguing over the price of ale, and most importantly, the scent of, well, something. It's hard to tell if that's supposed to be a meal or a damp mop left out too long. Welcome, dear viewers, to the wonderful world of medieval cuisine, where surviving each meal was a victory, and the real question wasn't, what's for dinner? But is this going to eliminate me from life? Today we're diving into why medieval food is nothing but disappointment. Spoiler alert, the good news is, you're alive. The bad news, so are the rats, and they have front row seats to your dinner. No anesthesia here, unless you count fainting from catching sight of your porridge. Breakfast doesn't give you energy, it just happens to you. And if you think food nourishes you, think again, it tests you. Strap on your chainmail bibs, because we're about to explore the gritty, disgusting, and occasionally hilarious reasons that would have you begging for a Twinkie. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Welcome to medieval farming, where growing food was less gardening and more gambling with your life. And spoiler alert, the house always won. The house being nature, or God, or whatever combination of drought, plague, and cow-related disasters happened that week. So you want to eat in the Middle Ages? First, grab a wooden plough, a couple of cows with a rebellious streak, and prepare to spend the next 12 hours every day trying to coax wheat from a patch of land that hasn't known mercy since the Romans left. Medieval Europe ran on agriculture, not in a peaceful village harvest scene kind of way, but in a, if the harvest fails, the kids die kind of way. Around 90% of the population were peasants, aka walking sunburns with shovels, who worked on land owned by some guy who probably couldn't tell a turnip from his own backside. And they didn't work the land for themselves. No. The local lord took a huge cut, the church took another, and the rats helped themselves to whatever was left. Let's talk about the tools of the trade. Modern tractors didn't exist, neither did basic common sense. Apparently, ploughs were made of wood, and dragged by oxen or very sad horses. No metal blades, no GPS planting rows, just hope, sweat, and the occasional profanity shouted at a rock you couldn't move. The soil wasn't great either, especially in northern Europe, where it was so thick and sticky, you'd think the land was actively trying to keep the food for itself. And don't even get us started on the weather. Medieval weather didn't care about your planting schedule. It rained when it wasn't supposed to, frosted right after you planted, and went on long sunny vacations when crops desperately needed a drink. A few bad weeks could mean total crop failure, and a total crop failure could mean famine. Not the Instagram fasting cleanse kind of famine, but the watch your neighbor eye your dog a little too hungrily kind. Now, crop rotation did exist, but it was barely out of its awkward medieval science fair stage. The three-field system was innovative for its time. 2 fields planted, 1 left fallow, but it was only practiced in some regions. In others, it was more like plant everywhere, and pray the soil doesn't die of exhaustion. Oh, and pests. Rats, locusts, weevils, beetles, basically the cast of a horror film, but for grain. Your beautiful barley harvest, half eaten by a swarm of insects that didn't even pay rent. You couldn't spray them with pesticides either. The best solution was sometimes just yelling at them and crying. Let's say, by some miracle, your wheat survived. Now you had to store it, which meant piling it in a thatch-roofed barn and hoping it didn't mold, rot, or become a rat. Airbnb. Spoiled grain wasn't just unpleasant, it could kill you. Ever heard of ergot? It's a fungus that grows on rye and causes hallucinations, seizures, and sometimes death. Medieval people literally tripped out just trying to make toast. Then there was the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, when weather went completely feral and crop after crop failed. People resorted to eating bark, shoe leather, and according to some records, each other. Yes, cannibalism wasn't unheard of. If the fields didn't produce, things got real dark, real fast. The line between dinner and desperation blurred in ways you do not want to imagine. And that brings us to seed grain. Farmers couldn't eat their entire harvest because they had to save some for next year's planting. So even in a good year, You had to pretend that the tastiest looking grain wasn't food, it was future food, which is hard when your kids are crying and your stomach is louder than the church bells. Let's not forget the taxes. Oh yes, because what's medieval life without being kicked while you're already face down in the mud? Lords demanded their share of your crops. Regardless of whether your field was bountiful or barren, you could hand over a bushel of withered barley, and they'd still scowl and demand more. If you didn't pay, you might lose your land or worse, be thrown in a very medieval jail, which was essentially a damp hole that smelled like failure. Humorous insert. Medieval farming, where you spend 8 months praying for rain, 4 months praying it'll stop, and 12 months wondering how your neighbour grew better turnips even though he can't count 10. So, in summary, medieval agriculture was like a team-building exercise designed by someone who hates you. The work was endless, the payoff uncertain, and your odds of starving were only slightly lower than your odds of being trampled by your own ox. And that, dear viewer, is just the beginning of your medieval food journey. Stick around, because next, we're diving into the wonderful world of moldy meat and creative preservation tactics that range from clever to why is this still twitching? So you managed to coax some food out of the dirt. Maybe even avoided the rats this time. Congratulations. Now the real challenge begins. How to keep that precious grub edible until the next harvest, which could be months away or never come. Medieval preservation was less locking in freshness and more staving off nature's grand decomposition party. Because refrigeration? Nope. Iceboxes? Nope. Even the noble castles mostly had cool cellars, which were great, if you didn't mind sharing your meat with the local bat population. Let's start with the reigning champion of preservation disasters, salting. The idea was simple. Salt draws moisture out of meat and fish, creating an environment that bacteria hate, or at least slow down. So your pork or herring got buried in piles of rock salt, which, fun fact, medieval folks mined by hand with pickaxes, and probably cursed a lot doing it. But here's the catch. Salt was precious and not always abundant, so sometimes the meat got lightly salted, which meant half rotten, half salt. The result was jerky-like slabs that could double as medieval doorstops, or worse, blunt weapons in a pinch. If you tried to eat a chunk of salted pork, you'd basically be chomping on something that tasted like a sweaty gym sock that had been sunbathing on a beach for a week. Then there was smoking, the slightly fancier cousin of salting. Smoking meat meant hanging it over a slow, smouldering fire, often in a smokehouse. This not only dried the meat, but gave it that signature campfire meets abandoned attic aroma. Nobles loved this method because it made the meat look sophisticated and helped keep the kitchen smoke detector, aka the entire castle, on high alert. Fish got the same treatment. Smoked herring, smoked eel, smoked anything that vaguely resembled seafood was a staple, because fresh fish was a rare luxury. If you were unlucky, you'd get a fish so heavily smoked it could probably double as a weapon or a doorstop, depending on the household budget. Onto pickling and fermentation, a preservation method that turned food into a science experiment that often smelled like it was one step away from summoning demons. Without vinegar, in many regions, pickling meant submerging vegetables, cabbage, cucumbers, onions, in brine or their own juices, and letting them rot. The idea was that the sour, putrid smell would scare off worse bacteria and help preserve some form of edible substance. Sauerkraut was the medieval version of eat this or starve, and if you weren't used to the pungent, sour taste, it felt like biting into a jar of liquid old socks. But fermentation had its perks. It could last for months and provided some essential vitamins in a diet that was otherwise a nutritional wasteland. Fruit also got this treatment, but with mixed results. Drying fruit was an early form of fruit jerky, sliced thin and sun-baked. But remember, the sun didn't always cooperate. A cloudy week meant your apples and pears ended up shriveled, sticky, and often covered in a fine layer of mold. Still better than nothing though, especially when fresh fruit was seasonal and rare. If you were a noble or wealthy merchant, you might have access to honey and sugar preserves. Honey was a magical preservative that could keep fruit and even meat edible for longer, but sugar was like medieval gold dust. So expensive it made modern luxury goods look like clearance items. Fancy fruit preserves and meat pastes mixed with exotic spices were a symbol of status as much as a food source. If you could afford it, Your dinner table looked like a tiny spice bazaar. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and sometimes bizarre additions like rosewater or even gold leaf. The downside, all that sugar and spice couldn't hide the fact your meat still tasted like it was one step away from making you hallucinate. Storage itself was a battlefield. Food was kept in wooden barrels, clay pots, or hanging from rafters. These larders were dark, damp, and perfect for attracting every mold, insect, and rodent within a 5-mile radius. A single forgotten loaf of bread could sprout a miniature fungal forest overnight. Mold was so common that people developed a touch test. If it crumbled into dust, it was probably okay. If it was furry and colourful, well, maybe give it to the pigs. And yes, sometimes mold was literally tolerated, because it was better than the alternative. Nothing. In fact, certain cheeses developed their flavour from mold, but that's a whole other story. In general, if your food had that smell, you'd consider yourself lucky if it didn't kill you outright. Sure, that slab of salted pork could last for months. The only problem? Nature's idea of months was closer to centuries ago. But hey, who doesn't love a little extra crunch in their dinner? All in all, medieval preservation was a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with rot and bacteria. Success meant you had food through the winter. Failure meant, well, let's just say you'd learn a lot about why not to eat the weird meat. So next time you pop open your fridge, thank your modern appliances. Because medieval folks, they survived by mastering the art of rot is just texture. Imagine medieval society as one giant dinner table, but the plates were wildly uneven, and the menu a complete social commentary. In medieval times, what you ate was less about personal taste and more about your place in the rigid class hierarchy. The food gap between peasants and nobles was so huge it could swallow a whole pig, and then some. First, meet the peasants and serfs, the backbone of medieval Europe, but when it came to food, basically the world's most unfortunate gourmets. Their diet was about survival, not flavour. They often lived on a monotonous loop of black bread, gruel, and watery pottage. Think of gruel as the medieval version of sad oatmeal, but less tasty and more likely to harbour the occasional surprise, like a worm or two. Protein? That was a luxury, often a fleeting one. Peasant protein mostly came from salted fish, or the rare lucky rabbit. If you were extremely fortunate, or the lord was very distracted, you might snag a pigeon or a handful of wild game. And if not, well, you could always hope the lord's hog didn't trample your field, because stealing was a death sentence. The irony was brutal. The peasants who grew the food got the scraps. If the harvest was bad, they simply starved or relied on wild plants, roots, and whatever they could forage. We're talking nettles, dandelion greens, or if desperate, boiled acorns. Spoiler, none of these taste good. On the flip side, the nobility lived like culinary royalty. Literally, their banquets were extravaganzas of multiple courses, sometimes lasting hours. The menu: roasted swan, peacock, because why settle for chicken? Venison, game birds, pies bursting with meat and spices, and sweets that looked like art projects. Noble meals were as much about showing off wealth as they were about eating. The more exotic the spices, the better. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves from the Moluccas, all imported at enormous expense. These spices masked the often questionable freshness of the meat, because hey, if you couldn't tell it was a bit off, did it really matter? Social status dictated not only what you ate, but how you ate it. Nobles had elaborate table manners, eating with knives, forks and spoons made of precious metals. Peasants, fingers were the tools of choice, along with a wooden spoon if you were lucky. Even the bread was a status symbol. Nobles munched on white, finely sifted bread that looked almost like edible clouds, while peasants gnawed on black bread so dense it could double as a weapon. The saying "you are what you eat" was never truer and more unfair than in medieval Europe. Another point of inequality was access to dairy and eggs. Peasants might get a splash of milk if their family owned a cow or goat, but it was often reserved for butter or cheese, luxuries on their own. Nobles had access to a range of cheeses, fresh cream and eggs for their many pies and custards. Alcohol was also class distinct. Peasants drank ale, sometimes homemade, sometimes questionable, but always safer than water. Nobles sipped imported wine, often sweetened with honey or flavored with spices, to show off their status. One fascinating aspect was how the church influenced food inequality. Religious fasting rules mandated meat-free days, which mostly hit peasants harder. They had less protein to begin with, and fish was a pricey alternative. Nobles often found loopholes or ate large quantities of fish prepared in rich sauces to circumvent these rules, so they didn't miss out on their calorie counts or fancy dining experiences. The social divide in food was so stark it reinforced the class system. Hungry peasants weren't just a tragedy, they were a warning. Nobles flaunted their feasts to remind everyone who held the power and the bread, while the peasants were eating watery stew that doubled as an insult to flavor. The nobles were busy carving roast peacock and tossing gold leaf on their pies. Talk about dinner with a side of, "We hate you." So the next time you complain about your office cafeteria, remember, at least you're not trying to survive on gruel, while your landlord hosts a feast that would make Gordon Ramsay jealous. The food divide wasn't just about calories or taste, it was about power, privilege, and a system that kept people hungry and others utterly stuffed. And this gap shaped medieval life more than you might think, from health and lifespan to social unrest. Imagine living a life where your stomach's happiness depends entirely on the whims of the seasons, and not in a "I'll have fresh berries in summer" way, but more like, if the calendar says winter, prepare to gnaw on leather. Medieval diets were not just shaped by what grew in the fields, but also by an unforgiving schedule of scarcity and feast, controlled by Mother Nature and a hefty dose of religious fasting. The calendar ruled medieval bellies with an iron fist, and hunger was as predictable as the changing of the leaves. Harvest time, usually in late summer or early fall, was the only moment peasants and nobles alike could count on a bounty. This was the joyous season, when fields overflowed with golden grains, root vegetables, apples and pears, and the air smelled of fresh bread baking in village ovens. Beer, arguably the safest beverage in a world where water could kill, flowed freely, and hearty stews simmered over open fires. People celebrated with festivals, thanking the gods or saints for the yield that would carry them through the bleak months ahead. It was a time when fresh food actually meant something, and every bite was a victory against the coming famine. But this window of plenty was heartbreakingly short. As autumn deepened, that glorious bounty started to rot or dry up. Apples shriveled into wrinkled reminders of summer, and fresh greens gave way to root vegetables stored in cellars, or sometimes buried in cold earth to keep just enough edible for a few more days. Root cellars were medieval refrigerators, but much less reliable. Potatoes, which wouldn't arrive in Europe until later centuries, were replaced by turnips, parsnips, and carrots that often turned soft, bitter, or downright moldy before consumption. Imagine trying to cook a mushy, half-rotten turnip. Your options were basically to eat it or go hungry. Winter was the true test of survival. The days shortened, the ground froze, and fresh produce was as rare as a polite medieval night. Salted hams and fish became staples, but these were about as appetizing as a sweaty old sock. People relied heavily on dried fruits, nuts, and anything preserved, but by the time winter dragged on, even these provisions grew thin. Hunger wasn't just a background worry, it was a daily reality that shaped behavior, culture, and even politics. Religious fasting made this seasonal struggle even more complex. Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, meant no meat, and for many, not even dairy or eggs, on certain days. Fasting wasn't just a choice, it was an obligation enforced by the church. This meant that peasants, already strapped for protein, had to stretch meager rations even thinner. Some tried to cheat the rules by sneaking fish into stews or pretending that fish heads were just extra flavor. Nobles, of course, found more creative loopholes, eating fish dishes lavishly prepared with rich sauces and butter substitutes to avoid breaking their vows while still enjoying plenty of calories. Spring, often called the hungry gap, was when larders were empty, fields were still barren, and fresh greens were a distant dream. Those lucky enough to find a fresh turnip or wild herbs considered themselves blessed. Riots and food shortages were common during this time, and famine was a very real threat. It was a cruel irony that after enduring the cold, lean months, people would face starvation before the fields could be planted and yield their next crop. Even the noble classes couldn't escape the seasonality entirely. While their larders and wine cellars were better stocked, the nobility still felt the pinch of the calendar. Fresh fruits and vegetables were delicacies, often imported at great expense or grown in guarded gardens. But when winter's grip tightened, their diets shifted towards salted meats and preserved foods, just like everyone else. The difference was that nobles had access to better preservation methods and could afford imported spices and sweeteners to mask the less than fresh flavors. What's fascinating is how this rigid seasonal cycle influenced medieval social life. Feast days and festivals were not just celebrations, they were critical psychological breaks from the harsh reality of hunger. When the calendar permitted, people gathered to share food, drink, and music, temporarily bridging the gap between starvation and sustenance. So the medieval year was a roller coaster of fullness and famine, dictated by the sun, soil, and superstition. Every season shaped what was on the table, how families survived, and even the mood of whole villages. To eat well was to beat the calendar, a feat only possible with luck, resources, or noble birth. If you thought medieval food was all about grand feasts and exotic spices, think again. For most people, the daily diet was grounded in a humble, gritty trio: bread, ale, and occasionally wine, though none of them were quite the delicacies we imagine today. These staples formed the core of medieval sustenance, but their reality was often a brutal test of jaw strength, stomach tolerance, and patience. Bread was the undisputed king of the medieval table. It wasn't just food, it was survival. But before you picture fluffy loaves or artisan baguettes, get ready for something quite different. The common folk, peasants and serfs, relied on black bread, baked from rye or barley flour. This bread was dense enough to double as a weapon if thrown, often baked in communal ovens at unpredictable temperatures. The result, a loaf so heavy and hard it might have been easier to chip away at with a hammer than bite into. Grit from leftover bits of stone or bran was an everyday surprise hiding in every slice, a medieval version of extra crunchy. This bread was not exactly a treat for the taste buds. It could be bitter, sour, or simply tasteless, especially when made from poor quality grains or when the harvest was bad. And because bread was so central, it served as a kind of edible plate. Meat, cheese, or stew might be served on top, or the bread itself, torn into chunks to scoop up whatever was on the table. If you were unlucky, the bread was stale, or so tough, you risked chipping a tooth just chewing it. Sometimes, it was practically used as a utensil, dunked repeatedly in watery broth to soften it, though this only prolonged the torture. For those who could afford it, usually merchants and nobles, there was white bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour. This bread looked much prettier, with a lighter color and softer texture. But don't be fooled. It often tasted bland and insubstantial, more like eating a pillow than a meal. White bread was a status symbol, showing you could afford the luxury of refined flour, even if the flavor left much to be desired. Now, onto the other essential liquid carbs, ale and beer. Medieval water sources were often contaminated, so drinking water straight was a risky gamble with disease. Ale, fermented barley or other grains, was a safer option, but it was a far cry from today's refreshing brew. It was typically brewed at home or locally, with inconsistent quality and a flavor profile that ranged from mildly unpleasant to outright awful. Imagine a thick, porridge-like liquid with a sharp sourness and a cloudy appearance. People drank it not because they loved the taste, but because it was less likely to kill them than the local well water. Beer, a cousin to ale but often brewed with hops, was slightly more refined. Longer brewing and the bittering effects of hops helped preserve the drink and improve its taste marginally. Merchants and wealthier townsfolk preferred beer, as it was considered a step up from the ale peasants drank daily. But by modern standards, it was still a far cry from tasty, more like drinking liquid bread, with all the charm of a wet sponge. For the upper class, wine was the beverage of choice, but even noble wine often needed a little help to go down. Imported from faraway lands, it was expensive, and because it was often stored in less than ideal conditions, it tended to turn sour or vinegary. To disguise this, winemakers and drinkers mixed in honey, spices, or herbs, basically turning wine into a medieval cocktail designed to hide its flaws. A common belief was that if a barrel contained a worm, it was a sign of divine blessing, although today, we might just call it a contamination hazard. Interestingly, the consumption of these drinks wasn't just about hydration. Ale and beer provided calories, energy, and some nutrients, which was crucial when food was scarce or boring. People often drank several pints a day, sometimes even children, who might be given small beer with very low alcohol content. This was safer than water and provided some comfort against the relentless grind of medieval life. The quality of bread and drink could vary dramatically depending on social status and season. In good harvest years, bread was lighter and more palatable, and ale might be stronger and fresher. In times of famine or poor harvests, however, bread was barely edible, and ale could be weak or sour, making every meal a challenge. So what does all this mean for the average medieval eater? It meant meals were often a test of endurance rather than pleasure. Chewing through tough bread was a workout for the jaw, washing it down with sour ale was an acquired taste at best, and sipping noble wine was a luxury many never knew. Yet these staples sustained millions through hard times, wars and plagues, forming the backbone of survival in a world where food security was a constant worry. In a nutshell, medieval bread and booze were less about gourmet dining and more about gritty practicality. They were the edible and drinkable constants in a world of unpredictable harvests and relentless hunger. And while today we might chuckle at the idea of bread as a weapon or ale as swamp water, these staples were the quiet heroes keeping medieval bellies full, well, as full as they could be. In medieval times, the idea of sinking your teeth into a juicy steak or a tender roast was more fantasy than everyday reality, unless you were part of the aristocracy throwing lavish feasts. For the vast majority, meat was the culinary equivalent of a rare gem, highly coveted, seldom seen, and usually reserved for special occasions or granted by the mercy of a lord's hunting party. The scarcity of real meat meant that most people had to get creative or desperate in their quest for protein. For peasants and serfs, meat was more often a tale told by storytellers than a regular ingredient on the dinner table. If they were lucky, and it was a non-fasting day, more on that later, they might enjoy a small portion of salted fish, a smidgen of preserved pork, or on very rare occasions, some wild game, rabbits, pigeons, or the occasional squirrel. But those treats were unpredictable, seasonal, and generally pitiful in size. You didn't just hunt, you prayed that the Lord's hog hadn't wandered into your field and ruined your already scant chance of catching dinner. The idea of fake meat in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly about plant-based substitutes or clever meat analogues like we have today. Instead, it meant using whatever scraps or bits of animal leftovers you could find and disguising them as something edible. Think of stews so thick with gristle, bones, and questionable gelatinous bits that you'd need a detective's keen eye to identify any actual flesh. Sometimes, cooks mixed in legumes or grains to bulk out the stew, turning it into a mushy mess that was more filler than feast. If the stew had a strong flavour, it was usually because of a dash of bitter herbs, spoiled vegetables, or the faint hint of rotting fish heads, a common secret ingredient for masking the absence of fresh meat. Even pigeons weren't safe from the medieval appetite. These birds, often seen fluttering around castle grounds and town squares, were an accessible form of protein for those who could catch them. But they were also fiercely protected, as noble households prized them for their use in pies or as status symbols. Poaching a pigeon was a serious offence, punishable by fines, imprisonment, or worse. So while you might hear about pigeon pie at a noble's banquet, sometimes with live birds bursting out for dramatic effect, peasants viewed them more like elusive ghosts, seen from afar but never caught. Hunting itself was an activity strictly regulated by laws designed to keep the meat for the aristocracy. Forests and hunting grounds were often designated as royal preserves, off-limits to commoners. Even owning a hunting dog was a privilege of the wealthy, making it nearly impossible for peasants to hunt game legally. Poachers risked harsh penalties, which meant that fresh meat was a luxury reserved for lords, knights, and the clergy. When the elite did enjoy meat, it was often in staggering variety and quantity. Banquets featured swan, venison, boar, and game birds like pheasants and partridges, meats chosen not only for taste but also for the statement they made about wealth and power. These lavish spreads could have multiple courses with different preparations, including roasted, boiled, and pie-filled varieties. Yet even these royal meats weren't always as appetizing as one might hope. Preservation methods were rudimentary, and sometimes meat was slightly spoiled before cooking, hence the extravagant use of spices and sauces to cover unpleasant flavors. On the rare occasions peasants did get meat, it was typically salted or smoked to last through the months without refrigeration. Salted pork or fish was common because the salt acted as a preservative, though it gave the meat a briny punch that could make even the hardiest stomach revolt. This preserved meat was often tough, chewy, and full of salt crystals that reminded you just how long it had been sitting in the pantry. Religious fasting also played a huge role in meat scarcity. Lent and other fasting periods forbade the consumption of meat for weeks at a time. This meant that, even if you had access to meat, you had to give it up, or risk both spiritual and social consequences. To cope, cooks improvised with fish, sometimes questionable fish parts like heads or eyeballs, and vegetarian dishes that were little more than watery stews. The creativity often came down to masking the blandness or unpleasant textures rather than enhancing flavor. Despite all these limitations, meat was the prize everyone wanted. It was seen as nourishment for strength, a symbol of status, and a break from the monotony of bread and pottage. The social divide in access to meat also reinforced class distinctions. While nobles savoured game birds and roasted boar, peasants made do with what they could scavenge, salt or fake. The medieval world was a place where hunger was constant, and meat was the luxury that reminded people of their place, either lucky enough to enjoy it often or resigned to dreaming of it between grueling workdays. In short, meat in medieval times was a privilege wrapped in scarcity, social laws, and necessity. It wasn't just about food, it was about power, survival, and sometimes desperate creativity in the kitchen. If you were a commoner, the sight of a roast on the Lord's table was less a tantalizing meal and more a reminder of the gap between the haves and have-nots. And if you were a pigeon, well, life was constantly looking over your shoulder. If you thought medieval food was all about epic meat feasts or endless loaves of black bread, think again. Vegetables and herbs played a surprisingly important, if often underappreciated, role in the daily grind of medieval eating. For the average person, greens weren't just a side dish. They were a sometimes slim, sometimes sad lifeline to nutrition and variety. Amid the relentless sameness of bread, pottage, and occasional meat scraps, medieval vegetables, however, were hardly glamorous. Root veggies like turnips, parsnips, and onions were staples. These hardy plants could survive the brutal seasons and were easy enough to store through the lean months, even if their texture and flavor left much to be desired. Turnips were often the default vegetable on a peasant's plate, hardly the Instagram-worthy roasted veggie medley of today. They could be boiled into a watery mush, or roasted until they were soft enough to pass as edible. Parsnips, the ancestor of today's sweeter carrot, often came off as woody and fibrous, while onions were a must-have for adding any semblance of flavor to the otherwise bland fare. Leafy greens were another story, both prized and problematic. Cabbage was the go-to green for most households. It was hardy, grew in less than ideal soil, and stored relatively well. It also could be pickled to make sauerkraut, giving peasants a winter source of vitamin C, which helped stave off scurvy. Other greens like leeks and wild herbs were foraged from fields and forests, especially by women and children tasked with supplementing family meals. This foraging wasn't a leisurely nature walk. It was often a desperate search for anything edible beyond root vegetables and stale bread. The medieval concept of salad was a far cry from the fresh, crunchy bowls we think of today. It might have been a handful of bitter herbs or a mix of dandelion leaves, nettles, and sorrel, plants that could poke and prod your tongue with wild, astringent flavors. These greens were often tossed with vinegar or oil if you had any, to make them less like eating a mouthful of lawn clippings, and more like something. The idea of a crisp lettuce leaf was largely absent, especially among the lower classes. Freshness was rare, and vegetables were typically boiled until they surrendered all their flavor and nutrients to a cloudy pot of pottage. Herbs, meanwhile, had an outsized role both in cooking and medicine. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme were common in noble kitchens, added to dishes not just for flavor but to impress guests with aromatic complexity. For peasants, the list of herbs was shorter and often tied to what could be gathered locally: nettles for their vitamins, fennel for digestion, or marjoram to add a touch of flavor to otherwise bland stews. These herbs were also used in folk remedies, blending the line between cooking and healing. If your stew tasted slightly like a forest floor, blame the handful of wild herbs someone threw in for good luck or health. Seasonality governed which veggies appeared on your table. Fresh peas, beans, and leafy greens were only around during spring and summer, while the rest of the year relied heavily on preserved vegetables or roots. This meant that the freshness of your vegetable plate was often a short-lived luxury, quickly replaced by pickled or dried versions that resembled more a science experiment than food. The social divide in vegetable consumption was as stark as with meat. Nobles had access to a wider variety of imported vegetables and exotic herbs, including artichokes, asparagus, and saffron, which could turn even the dullest dish into a luxurious experience. Peasants, meanwhile, were stuck with what their small plots could grow, or what they could gather from common lands, often under threat of fines or punishments if they overstepped property lines. Cooking vegetables was a challenge in its own right. Without modern conveniences like refrigeration or fresh water, cooks had to rely on lengthy boiling or stewing, which could drain flavor and nutrients. The famous medieval pottage, an all-purpose stew, was often a dumping ground for whatever vegetables were available, boiled to mush, along with some grains, and the occasional bit of meat or fish. Texture and taste were sacrificed in favor of bulk and calories. Still, vegetables were crucial. They provided vital vitamins and minerals in a diet that otherwise leaned heavily on carbohydrates and limited proteins. The ability to grow, gather, or preserve vegetables could make the difference between mere survival and outright starvation, especially in those brutal lean months when meat was nowhere to be found and bread was little more than sawdust. And then there was the matter of presentation. Nobles took great pride in arranging vegetables in elaborate displays, roasted, glazed, or sculpted into shapes to impress guests and display their wealth. A peasant's plate, by contrast, was more about function than flair, a bowl of whatever was left, eaten quickly before the next day's work. In the end, medieval vegetables and herbs were humble heroes of the table, offering nutrition, flavor, and occasional variety in an otherwise monotonous diet. While they lacked the glamour and luxury of meat or spices, their role was indispensable. Without them, the medieval diet would have been even bleaker, like a play with only one actor and no stage props. When you picture a medieval feast, you probably imagine a long table groaning under the weight of golden platters, exotic dishes, and goblets brimming with the finest wine. The truth? Medieval noble banquets were indeed extravagant, but not always in ways that made the food actually enjoyable. Instead, these feasts often felt like a competitive performance, where excess was the main course and digestion was an afterthought. Noble banquets were less about satisfying hunger and more about flaunting status. If your neighbor lord served 5 courses, you'd be expected to outdo him with 10. The sheer volume of food wasn't just for eating, it was a statement. Roasted swan, peacock, and wild boar could show up on the same table, alongside pies stuffed with mystery meats, sometimes so well hidden inside pastry that even the cooks forgot what was inside. These pies might even feature the infamous live bird surprise, cut into the crust, and tiny birds would flap out, providing both spectacle and, let's be honest, some serious shock value. The nobles loved it. The peasants, not so much, especially when they were reminded of the luxury they were denied. Despite the abundance, the actual taste of the food was often a gamble. Cooking techniques varied wildly and relied heavily on spices, which nobles splurged on to mask the sometimes questionable freshness of their ingredients. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves weren't just for flavor, they were weapons in a battle against the off-taste of meat that had spent days in transit. Sugar, imported at great expense from faraway lands, was sprinkled liberally on dishes. Sweet pies, preserved fruits, and sugared meats, sometimes more for show than palatability. Imagine biting into a piece of roasted meat that tastes like it's been dusted with powdered candy, rather than seasoned to perfection. The centerpiece of any banquet was the sheer variety and spectacle. Tables featured dozens of dishes served in sequence, from delicate fish to hefty roasts to rich custards. But it wasn't just about the food itself. The presentation mattered. Foods were dyed bright colors, carved into shapes, or even constructed into elaborate displays. One famous example was the subtleties, decorative, sometimes edible sculptures made from sugar or marzipan, depicting scenes from mythology, animals, or inside jokes. These were designed to wow guests and demonstrate the host's wealth and sophistication. The more outrageous and complicated, the better. Between courses, entertainment was a crucial part of the evening's program. Minstrels, jugglers, dancers, and even fire eaters would perform, ensuring that guests stayed amused while they digested, or tried to digest, the barrage of food. This was also a strategic move. Loud music, and lively performances distracted diners from any gastronomic disappointments. If the stew was bland or the pie dry, no one noticed because the jesters were juggling flaming torches next to the table, drinks flowed freely, and nobles took pride in their cellars stocked with wines imported from France, Italy, or Spain. These wines were often fortified with honey or spices, disguising their vinegary imperfections. Wine was both a social lubricant and a status symbol. The finer the vintage or the more flamboyant the label, the more prestige it conferred on the host. But just like the food, drinking was often a gamble. Noble guests might find themselves sipping on a beverage closer to vinegar than the sweet nectar they imagined. Despite all this extravagance, medieval feasts came with their own share of digestive regrets. Overindulgence was common, and it wasn't unusual for guests to feel queasy or downright ill after a banquet. The combination of heavy meats, sugar-laden dishes, and copious wine could lead to bloating, stomach aches, and in some cases, outright food poisoning. Medical knowledge being limited, these symptoms were often chalked up to bad humors or the influence of evil spirits rather than the host's cooking skills. Interestingly, medieval nobles also believed in balancing their feasts with purging rituals. After a particularly lavish banquet, some would visit bathhouses or use herbal remedies to cleanse their bodies. This was the medieval version of a detox, except it often involved induced vomiting or enemas. So while the banquet was a display of opulence, the aftermath could be less glamorous. Social dynamics also played a role in the experience of these feasts. Seating arrangements were a carefully orchestrated dance of politics and hierarchy. The highest-ranking guests sat closest to the lord, where the best food and wine were served. Lower-ranked nobles might be relegated to the far ends of the table, where the leftovers were more common. And if you were unlucky enough to be a minor courtier or visiting dignitary of lesser status, your plate might be the one that contained last week's leftovers, disguised with enough spices to mask the flavor. Yet despite all the pomp and occasional culinary disappointment, medieval banquets were undeniably the place to be if you wanted to network, display power, and enjoy a rare break from the rigors of noble life. These feasts weren't just meals, they were social theatre, where food, entertainment, and spectacle came together in a dizzying, sometimes overwhelming performance. Now in medieval Europe, the church wasn't just the spiritual centre of life, it was also the ultimate referee of what you could and couldn't shove down your gullet. Religious food restrictions shaped the medieval diet more than any king's decree or seasonal shortage ever could. Fasting days, abstinence rules, and an endless litany of dietary commandments meant that your stomach was often at war with your faith, and the church's guidelines rarely made eating any easier or more enjoyable. The medieval church dictated strict food laws, especially around fasting periods like Lent, Advent, and various saints' days. During Lent, meat was off limits for almost everyone, except, of course, monks and clergy, who sometimes found creative loopholes to bend the rules. Fish, being considered a cold-blooded creature, was allowed, but even that came with plenty of caveats and weird exceptions. The result, for many, Lent was a long stretch of eating fish heads, salted cod, and whatever else the local waters could grudgingly provide. Fasting wasn't just about skipping meat. It often meant limiting the quantity of food altogether, or restricting certain indulgences like eggs, dairy, or even olive oil. In some regions, lay people had to avoid butter and cheese during specific days, while monks debated endlessly whether eating eggs laid during the fasting period counted as breaking the fast. Spoiler, it often did, unless the eggs were hidden in other dishes or baked into bread where they were hard to detect. The religious calendar was so tightly interwoven with food rules that common folk planned their entire weeks around when they could feast freely, and when they had to starve themselves, or at least pretend to. Monasteries were both the enforcers, and ironically, the innovators of these food laws. While monks lived under strict fasting rules, their culinary creativity was unmatched. To survive months of meatless days, they developed elaborate recipes centered on fish, vegetables, and grains. More than that, they perfected the art of simulated meat dishes, combining pulses, nuts, mushrooms, and eggs, in ways that vaguely resembled meat's texture and heft. These concoctions were the medieval version of vegetarian meatloaf, meant to fool both body and soul. One favorite monastic trick was the mock meat pie, where chopped nuts, dried fruits, and heavily spiced vegetables were baked into a crust, so rich and aromatic that you might forget you weren't actually biting into venison or pork. Of course, no medieval diner was fooled for long, but it was a clever way to keep some variety during long fasts. Other monks experimented with fermented foods and cheeses to add depth to their otherwise plain meals. The Church's obsession with food also extended to the concept of sinful and virtuous eating. Gluttony was considered one of the 7 deadly sins, so feasting too heartily, or too often, was spiritually dangerous. That didn't stop nobles from throwing enormous banquets, but common folk learned to balance their hunger with piety by rationing their food and making fasting a religious act of humility. Even then, many peasants saw fasting days as cruel trials when they had to survive on watery pottage, dry bread, and stale fish scraps. Some fasting rules even created bizarre loopholes. For example, the Church forbade eating meat, but allowed eating animals that weren't traditionally considered meat, such as beavers or porpoises, which were classified as fish for the sake of religious law. So a nobleman could technically dine on beaver tail during Lent, and still claim he hadn't broken his fast. Medieval diet was, in many ways, a legalistic minefield where loopholes were prized skills, and cooking became a game of theological dodgeball. Drinking was subject to its own set of religious regulations too. Wine was generally allowed, but had to be consumed in moderation, though moderation was a flexible concept when you were trying to drown the pain of fasting. Ale and beer were sometimes restricted during fasting, especially in stricter monastic orders, who preferred water if it wasn't too suspect, or herbal infusions to keep their tongues busy. Fasting was also socially divisive. While the Church demanded strict adherence, enforcement varied widely. Nobles and wealthy merchants sometimes ignored fasting rules altogether, or hired cooks to devise elaborate meals that complied with the letter of the law, but not the spirit. Think of rich fish pies dripping with butter and cream. Peasants, on the other hand, had fewer options and often couldn't afford meat in the first place. So fasting was less about sacrifice and more about survival through scarcity. One unintended side effect of all these food rules was the creation of a culinary calendar that revolved around when you could eat meat or indulge in rich foods, making feasting days feel even more special, and ironically, encouraging overindulgence when the Church lifted restrictions. It was feast or famine in a very literal spiritual and dietary sense. And so, the Church's grip on medieval eating was tight, complicated, and sometimes downright confusing. But through fasting rules, loopholes, and religious fervor, medieval people navigated a complicated world where the spiritual and the culinary collided, often leaving their stomachs a little bewildered and always hungry for the next feast day. If you thought modern food safety was tricky, welcome to medieval dining, where every meal was basically a roll of the dice, a gamble between survival and stomach disaster. Medieval kitchens were more of a biological experiment than a place to make edible meals. Spoiled food, cross-contaminated dishes, and a parade of parasites turning your innards into their playground were the norm. Surviving lunch without a bout of what they might have called the fiery grip of the bowels was less a given and more a small miracle. First off, refrigeration was non-existent. The concept of fresh food wasn't the standard. It was a fleeting luxury. Most foods were salted, smoked, or dried to extend shelf life. But even these methods only delayed the inevitable invasion of mold, bacteria, and various unwelcome critters. If the medieval cook was lucky, the salting was thorough enough to keep meat from turning into an aroma so foul it could clear a village square. If not, you were in for a surprise that started with a funny smell and ended with, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. Kitchens themselves were a hazardous zone. They were often cramped, smoky, and dirtier than a pigsty after festival day. Food prep surfaces were wooden tables, rarely scrubbed beyond a quick scrape, and utensils passed from hand to hand without much regard for cleanliness. Flies, rats, and mice were common uninvited guests, and many a meal was seasoned with whatever those pests left behind. Even worse, kitchens sometimes doubled as living quarters or storage spaces for animal feed and firewood, meaning that contamination was almost guaranteed. Water, which was already questionable as a drink, was also used in cooking and washing. When your water source was a river running through the village, often shared with animals and full of human waste, disease spread was a serious risk. And if you thought washing your hands before dinner was a thing, think again. Soap was an expensive luxury, mostly used for laundry or shaving. Medieval cooks relied more on hope than hygiene, and that was a dangerous gamble. Then there were the parasites, tiny villains invisible to the naked eye, but very much real in their medieval reign of terror. Tapeworms, roundworms, and a host of other intestinal freeloaders made their way into plates through undercooked meat, contaminated water, or simply from poor sanitation. Infestation wasn't just unpleasant, it could be deadly, causing malnutrition, stomach pain, and sometimes even death. Children were especially vulnerable, and many never outgrew the discomfort of a body crawling with unwelcome guests. The unfortunate truth is that what we now consider common sense in food preparation, thorough cooking, clean water, sterilized surfaces, was barely on the radar. The medieval cook's motto might as well have been, if it's not crawling with maggots yet, it's still good to eat. Spoilage was masked with strong spices, vinegar, or excessive salt, trying to hide that unmistakable scent of decay. Sometimes, cooks relied on guesswork. If the smell wasn't too overwhelming, and the color didn't scream danger, the food was served. Even feasts and banquets, where you might expect better fare, were subject to these risks. The more exotic the dish, the higher the chance it involved questionable ingredients or poor handling. Dishes like pies filled with undercooked meats, offal stews, or fish that had been sitting out too long could turn a noble's stomach revolt into a full-blown public spectacle. Food poisoning was common enough that it earned colourful nicknames, and chronic bouts were just accepted as part of life. One infamous condition was known as the flux, a catch-all medieval diagnosis for severe diarrhea caused by spoiled or contaminated food. Sufferers were often bedridden and at the mercy of rudimentary remedies involving herbs, potions, or the ever-popular bloodletting. Spoiler alert, bloodletting didn't help and usually made things worse. The ever-present threat of foodborne illness led to strange superstitions and practices. Some believed that certain herbs or prayers could protect a meal from evil spirits or bad humors that caused sickness. Others thought that eating in a particular order, starting with bread or sour foods, could guard against poisoning. And yes, there were those who suspected their neighbors of deliberate food tampering, leading to accusations of witchcraft or foul play when multiple people got sick after a communal meal. Despite all this, people kept eating. Hunger was a far greater enemy than food poisoning. The risk of getting sick was simply something to accept, because the alternative was starvation. Medieval diners developed surprisingly resilient digestive systems, or perhaps just a high tolerance for suffering. So, the medieval diet was a high-stakes game of cuisine roulette, where every bite could be your last, or at least your most miserable for a few days. The combination of inadequate preservation, sketchy kitchens, parasitic freeloaders, and minimal hygiene made every meal a gamble. But somehow, through ingenuity, superstition, and stubborn survival instinct, people kept dining and passing down recipes, even if those recipes often came with a side of risk. And there you have it, a wild, sometimes gross, but always fascinating look into what people actually ate in medieval times. From rock-hard bread bricks to suspicious swamp water ales, and a daily gamble with food poisoning that would make any modern foodie shudder, it's clear medieval dining was no gourmet experience. But hey, they survived. And so do we, thanks to modern kitchens and a lot less grit in our meals. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30th, 1853, in the small village of Zundert, in the Netherlands. Now, if you picture him as the wild-haired, paint-splattered genius we all know today, his early years might surprise you, because young Vincent was actually more of a quiet, serious kid. He came from a religious family. His father was a pastor, which might explain some of Vincent's lifelong obsession with deep questions like, what's the meaning of life, and why is this so painfully hard? Growing up in a strict household where Sunday sermons were probably more common than cartoons, Vincent was a bit of an oddball, not in the wearing socks with sandals way, but in the lost in his own head kind of way. He wasn't exactly the star athlete or the class clown. In fact, he was known to be a bit awkward, shy, and prone to melancholy, which, if you're familiar with his later work, starts to make a lot of sense. If there was a middle child syndrome for artists, Vincent had it hard. He was the eldest surviving son, which meant he had to set an example, but he mostly failed at that. Early on, He seemed to struggle with figuring out what he wanted to do with his life, a feeling many of us know way too well. At one point, he worked for the art dealers Gogh, and which was basically the art world's version of a cubicle job, selling prints and paintings to rich clients. Picture this: young Vincent in a three-piece suit, stuck behind a desk, selling fancy paintings he didn't even get to create himself. If that's not the beginning of an existential crisis, I don't know what is. He was good at the job, but he wasn't happy. After a few years of bouncing around offices in The Hague, London and Paris, he got fired, which honestly might have been a blessing in disguise, because apparently being a salesman just wasn't his calling. Next, he tried his hand at becoming a preacher like his dad. Spoiler alert, that didn't go so well either. Vincent was so passionate about his beliefs that he began preaching to coal miners in Belgium without any official training or a license. Imagine showing up at a church, and the guy at the pulpit looks like he's been painting all night and barely slept. The church authorities thought the same thing, and told him to stop. It's like trying to crash a party with a paintbrush instead of a gift. So here's Vincent, in his mid-20s, hopping between jobs like a nervous grasshopper, none of which really fit. The one thing he couldn't stop doing, drawing and sketching. He wasn't painting yet, but his sketches, mostly scenes of peasants in the countryside, were raw and emotional. It was as if he was trying to capture life's grit with every pencil stroke. Around this time, Vincent began what some might call his awkward adulting phase. You know, the part of life where you desperately want to figure out who you are, but end up making every possible embarrassing decision first. For Van Gogh, this meant trying to find love, or at least someone who wouldn't run away screaming at the sight of his intensity. There's a lot of talk about Vincent's romantic life being tragic, and that's putting it mildly. He fell hard and fast for women who mostly rejected him, which led to some painfully awkward moments. One of the most famous was his infatuation with his cousin Key Vos Stricker. Yep, he tried to date his cousin, and surprise, surprise, she wasn't having it. Talk about family drama. His letters from this time reveal a man who was earnest, desperate, and maybe just a little bit socially clueless. It's the kind of awkwardness we all feel when you accidentally call your teacher mom or send a text meant for your best friend to your crush. Except for Vincent, it was way more intense, filled with philosophical rants and a whole lot of self-doubt. This phase of his life was marked by a lot of trial and error, but also by a clear sense that he was searching for something bigger. He wanted meaning, connection, and a place where he could express himself fully, and he was starting to suspect that art might just be the way. But don't get the idea that he suddenly became an artistic genius overnight. Oh no. Vincent's early art experiments were awkward, rough, and sometimes downright gloomy. Kind of like your first attempts at cooking or playing guitar. But the seeds were planted. In these formative years, Van Gogh was wrestling with himself, his faith, his purpose, his identity, while fumbling his way through adulthood. It was a life full of awkward first steps, painful lessons, and the kind of existential crises that would make most people binge-watch TV instead of pick up a paintbrush. And so began the story of a man who would change the art world forever, starting not with a brush, but with a series of uncertain, sometimes embarrassing, but always heartfelt steps toward finding his place in the world. After years of fumbling through unsuitable jobs and romantic misfires, Vincent van Gogh finally landed where he was meant to be, in front of a canvas. Or at least, that was the plan. The catch? He had no formal training, no fancy art school diploma, and zero clue about the traditional rules of painting. Basically, he was the original self-taught rebel artist, long before DIY became a thing. Starting in his late 20s, an age when most artists are already well into their masterpieces, Vincent decided to dive headfirst into art. And by dive headfirst, I mean he basically threw himself into it, with the same awkward enthusiasm as a kid, learning to ride a bike on a tightrope while juggling paintbrushes. You see, Van Gogh didn't have a teacher telling him what to do, no stern professor to say, "That tree looks too wobbly, try again." Instead, he studied the works of others obsessively, copying them, trying to absorb their techniques. His role models, the great masters of the past, sure, but also the ordinary people around him. He wanted to paint peasants, miners, farmers, the working class living harsh, real lives, far from the polished portraits of aristocrats or the heavenly scenes in churches. His early paintings and sketches reflect this gritty focus. They were dark, moody, and sometimes downright grim. Which makes sense considering Van Gogh painted mostly in dreary, rainy places with little sunlight, like the coal mining village of Borinage in Belgium. The people he painted were tough, worn out by life, their faces lined with hardship and hands hardened by work. He didn't sugarcoat anything. If life was hard, Van Gogh wanted to show it honestly. If you imagine the starving artist trope, unkempt hair, ragged clothes, living off crumbs and hope, Van Gogh pretty much invented it. He looked like he'd just rolled out of bed after a week-long paint binge. In fact, friends and neighbors often described him as gaunt, dirty, and ragged, with a fierce intensity in his eyes. The starving artist aesthetic was not a fashion statement, it was a lifestyle. This wasn't just a look, it was a sign of how deeply Van Gogh threw himself into his craft. He often neglected basic needs, like food and sleep, while he sketched and painted. His clothes? Forget about it. He wore whatever was handy, often second-hand and patched. Hygiene? That was probably somewhere behind the easel, collecting dust. Early on, Van Gogh worked mostly in charcoal and pencil, creating detailed drawings of peasants and rural life. One of his most famous early works, The Potato Eaters, painted around 1885, is the perfect example. It shows a family gathered around a dimly lit table, eating their meager meal of potatoes, the food staple of the poor. The painting is dark, earthy, and unpretentious. It wasn't meant to be pretty, it was meant to be real. The piece received mixed reviews at the time. Some thought it was too raw, too coarse, too, well, potatoey. But Vincent loved it, because it captured the dignity and struggle of the working class. The rough brush strokes and muddy colours reflected the reality of life, not the romanticized version that was popular in art salons. Another big influence on Van Gogh was the Dutch painter Jean-François Millet, who was famous for depicting rural workers with respect and empathy. Van Gogh admired Millet so much that he created copies of his paintings to study his technique. It was like he was saying, "Okay, Millet, I see you. Now watch me mess this up a bit, before I make it my own." And mess up he did, but in a good way. Van Gogh's early style was experimental, raw, and emotional. He didn't worry about making everything look perfect or smooth. Instead, he emphasized feeling, movement, and the story behind the subject. The brushstrokes were heavy and bold, sometimes almost aggressive, as if the paint was fighting to escape the canvas. At this stage, Vincent was still figuring out his palette. Instead of the bright, swirling colors we associate with him today, his early paintings were often dominated by dark browns, greens, and grays, the muddy colors of peasant life. But even in those darker tones, you can see his passion and sensitivity shining through. Despite his obvious talent, Van Gogh struggled to find buyers for his early work. Art dealers preferred polished, decorative pieces that could hang in wealthy homes. No one wanted paintings of grim-faced farmers eating potatoes, so poor Vincent was stuck in the classic artist's dilemma. Brilliant work, zero sales. He lived a life of almost extreme poverty during this period, barely affording food and shelter. Letters to his brother Theo, who thankfully became his financial and emotional lifeline, reveal a man who was simultaneously full of hope and despair. He dreamed of success, but felt trapped by his own inexperience and the harsh realities of the art market. But here's the thing, Van Gogh's struggle as a self-taught artist wasn't just about technique or money. It was about proving to himself that art could be a language strong enough to speak the truth of human experience. While others painted polished portraits for rich patrons, Vincent painted the soul of ordinary people, raw and unfiltered. And this stubborn commitment to his vision, even in the face of poverty and rejection, is what started setting Van Gogh apart from other artists of his time. He was not a talent waiting to be discovered. He was a force that demanded to be heard, even if it meant painting in the shadows for years. So picture this, a ragged man in a tiny attic room surrounded by crumpled sketches, smelling like paint and unwashed socks, obsessively working through the night. Not glamorous, sure, but it was the birth of the Van Gogh style we all recognize now. The man who painted from the heart, messy, passionate, and utterly unforgettable. And that's how The Apprentice became an artist. The road ahead was rough, colourful, and full of surprises, but Vincent had taken his first real steps into the world that would change art forever. If you thought Vincent van Gogh's life was all about paint and peasants, think again. Before the world knew him for starry skies and swirling sunflowers, Van Gogh was better known in some circles as the king of complicated romances and emotional chaos. His love life was a roller coaster, without any safety harness, of course, and it played a massive part in the build-up to one of the most bizarre episodes in art history, the infamous ear incident. Let's start with the basics. Vincent was hopelessly awkward when it came to love. And I don't mean forgot to text back awkward. I mean full-on writing desperate, slightly creepy letters awkward. This man wore his heart on his sleeve, but unfortunately his timing and delivery were as messy as his paint palette. Vincent's relationships rarely went smoothly, and most ended with rejection, heartbreak, or a combination of both. One of his earliest crushes was on his cousin Kivos Stricker. Yes, that's right, the same cousin mentioned in the early days of his life. But instead of sweet family gatherings, Vincent's feelings made things uncomfortable, to say the least. Key wasn't interested, and reportedly told him bluntly that she'd never marry him. A fact that crushed Vincent, but didn't exactly inspire him to tone down his advances. But Vincent wasn't one to give up. He was persistent, if nothing else. After Key, he tried to woo a few more women, including a prostitute and a woman named Clasina Maria Hornick, known as Cian, who was a mother struggling with addiction and poverty. Now, if you thought dating Cian was smooth sailing, think again. This relationship was fraught with difficulties, not just emotional but social and financial. Vincent tried to help Cian get back on her feet, even moving her and her children into a house near him. But the stress weighed heavily on both of them. By this point, Vincent's mental health was becoming a concern. The man who was so passionate about art was now wrestling with loneliness, rejection, and a gnawing sense that he was misunderstood. By women, by family, by the world. And this emotional turmoil would only intensify in the years ahead. Then came Arles, the place that would become the backdrop for the most dramatic moment of Vincent's life. In 1888, Vincent moved to the south of France, hoping the sunny climate would help lift his spirits and inspire his work. It was also where he dreamed of creating an artist community, something like a colourful commune where painters could live and work together. Enter Paul Gauguin, another big name in art history, who agreed to come stay with Vincent for a while. The two artists shared a complicated friendship. Gauguin was the confident, more established artist, and Van Gogh was the intense, unstable genius trying to find his footing. Their personalities clashed wildly. Gauguin was urbane and calm. Vincent was passionate and impulsive. This was not the kind of friendship you'd invite to a dinner party unless you wanted fireworks. The tension between them built over weeks, fueled by arguments about art, philosophy, and maybe a little jealousy. Vincent was eager to impress Gauguin and prove that his style was valid, but the pressure also pushed his mental state to the edge. It's important to remember that Vincent was not just an emotional mess for the sake of drama. He struggled with serious mental health issues, including depression and possibly bipolar disorder. The emotional strain was real and painful. Now, when you think about Van Gogh and the ear incident, you probably imagine something straightforward. Vincent losing it in a fit of madness, slicing off his ear in a rage. But the truth is messier and far more interesting than that popular myth. On a cold December night in 1888, after yet another heated argument with Gauguin, Vincent did something shocking, but not exactly the gruesome ear amputation story that gets passed around. He actually cut off a part of his left earlobe, not the entire ear, and then, incredibly, wrapped it carefully and delivered it to a local woman named Rachel, a prostitute he knew. Yes, Vincent basically showed up at Rachel's door with a bloody gift. Talk about awkward. What motivated this bizarre act? Scholars have debated it endlessly. Was it a desperate cry for help, a symbolic gesture, a moment of total mental breakdown? The exact reasons might be lost to history, but what's clear is that it was a turning point, one that led to Vincent being hospitalized and his mental health care becoming a central part of his life. This event wasn't just a random freakout. It was the climax of months of emotional tension, failed relationships, and the immense pressure Vincent put on himself as an artist and human being. It's also a reminder that behind every genius is a person struggling with demons we often don't see. So, before the ear was ever severed, there were years of unrequited love, awkward advances, emotional turmoil, and fragile friendships. Vincent's heart wasn't just on his sleeve. It was tangled in knots, bruised, and desperately seeking connection. And in this turbulent emotional landscape, the famous ear incident found its roots. In a way, this chapter of Vincent's life feels painfully relatable. Who among us hasn't felt like a walking disaster when it comes to love? Who hasn't wanted to scream or send a message that just ends up sounding odd? The difference is that Vincent's oddness was painted on canvas and echoed through history. And just like that, with a snip and a wrapped earlobe, the world's most famous starving artist reminded us all that the line between genius and madness is sometimes thinner than a paintbrush stroke. When it comes to Vincent van Gogh, there's one story that everyone knows, whispers about, or dramatically reenacts in art class. The tale of the ear. The infamous ear-cutting incident has become a kind of legendary shorthand for the tortured artist stereotype. But like most legends, the reality is more complicated, and frankly, a lot more interesting than just Van Gogh lost his mind and chopped off his ear. Let's start with the basics. Yes, Van Gogh did cut off part of his ear, but no, it wasn't the entire ear, and it wasn't just some impulsive outburst during a fit of madness. The ear incident was actually a complex event with layers of emotional, psychological, and maybe even physical factors all tangled up. Picture this. December 23rd, 1888, in Arles, a quaint town in the south of France. Vincent and his housemate and fellow artist Paul Gogh had been roommates for a couple of months, sharing art, ideas, and more importantly, intense arguments. These two were like oil and water, only instead of peacefully coexisting, their differences kept sparking explosive conflicts. After a particularly fiery quarrel, Vincent took an unexpected and extreme step. Armed with a razor, he severed a part of his left earlobe. Not the whole thing, mind you, just the lower flap, which he carefully wrapped in cloth. Then, in an act that defies easy explanation, he walked to a nearby brothel and handed the bloody parcel to a local prostitute named Rachel. Yes, this was not just a random act of self-harm, but one loaded with symbolism, desperation, and maybe a touch of dramatic flair. But before we get too carried away imagining Vincent storming off with bloodied hands, let's unpack the many theories and myths that have grown around this moment. Myth 1. Van Gogh cut off his ear in a jealous rage over Gogh. This is the classic Hollywood version. The story goes that, after a massive fight, maybe about art, maybe about who left the toilet seat up, Vincent lost control and mutilated himself in a blind fury. It's dramatic, simple, and emotionally satisfying, but there's little solid evidence to back it up. In reality, their relationship was more complicated. They fought, sure, but Vincent's act wasn't just about anger directed at Gogh. It was deeply personal and likely connected to Vincent's ongoing mental health struggles. Myth 2. Van Gogh was drunk and insane, completely out of control. While Vincent certainly had a tumultuous mind, and yes, he drank absinthe, a famously potent drink that's been blamed for many artistic madness tales, he wasn't a raving lunatic staggering around with no clue what he was doing. The act was violent, yes, but it also showed a kind of precision, cutting only part of the ear, wrapping it carefully, then seeking out someone to deliver it to. That suggests a cry for help, a desperate attempt to communicate pain or loneliness, rather than pure madness. The exact details are still debated by historians, but here's the best supported version based on letters, eyewitness reports, and medical records. In the days leading up to the incident, Vincent's mental health was deteriorating rapidly. He was battling episodes of deep depression, paranoia, and intense anxiety. He felt isolated, misunderstood, and under immense pressure, both from himself and from the failures he perceived in his art and personal relationships. His argument with Gogh was the straw that broke the camel's back. Gogh had already decided to leave Arles, which devastated Vincent. Feeling abandoned and overwhelmed, Vincent's mental state spiraled. In this vulnerable moment, he turned the razor on himself. After the self-mutilation, Vincent's behavior was a mixture of confusion, pain, and desperate hope. By delivering the ear to Rachel, he might have been reaching out for connection, though the message was cryptic, to say the least. Vincent was hospitalized shortly afterward, and the incident marked the beginning of a long, difficult battle with mental illness. The ear episode wasn't just a freak accident, but a visible sign of how fragile Vincent's mental state had become. Some doctors have speculated that Vincent may have been suffering from epilepsy, bipolar disorder, or even temporal lobe epilepsy, conditions that can involve seizures, hallucinations, and extreme mood swings. Others think his symptoms may have been exacerbated by malnutrition, excessive drinking, and the stress of his isolated lifestyle. Regardless, the ear incident is a powerful symbol. It shows that genius and suffering often go hand in hand, but it's also a reminder that mental illness is real, painful, and deeply human. The ear story has been retold, reimagined, and mythologized for over a century. It's been the subject of books, movies, paintings, naturally, and even psychological studies. It's become shorthand for the tortured artist archetype, though Vincent himself was much more than that. Ironically, while the ear story grabs headlines, it overshadows some of the most beautiful and innovative aspects of Van Gogh's life and work. But maybe that's the point. The ear is a stark, raw symbol that reminds us how close to the edge Vincent often was, and how his art emerged from that edge. So what can we learn? Vincent's ear episode wasn't just a bad day or a weird accident. It was a cry for help, a physical manifestation of emotional agony. It reminds us to look deeper behind dramatic headlines, to see the person struggling beneath the surface. And it also teaches us something important about creativity. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's painful, and sometimes it leaves you with a bandaged ear and a story that will echo through history. If Van Gogh's early works were painted in shades of despair and cabbage-brown melancholy, then Arles was when his palette threw a full-blown tantrum in the best way possible. Picture it: the south of France, 1888, sun-drenched fields, bright blue skies, golden wheat, and Vincent van Gogh arriving on the scene like a man freshly smitten with light itself. After years of struggling through dull cities and even duller moods, Vincent packed up his brushes and made the radical decision to chase the sun. He left behind Paris's grey rooftops and headed to Arles, believing the southern light would give him the artistic breakthrough he was so desperately searching for. He wasn't wrong. Though he may have arrived with mental baggage heavier than his canvas load, Arles would become the place where Vincent's vision burst into full bloom, and also where things got just a bit weird. Imagine someone raised in cloudy northern Europe suddenly discovering sunlight. That was Van Gogh. The moment he stepped into Arles, his entire perspective changed. The muddy, earthy tones of his earlier work were replaced with colour so bright it practically screamed at the canvas. Yellows that could blind a canary, blues deeper than your last existential crisis, and greens that made vegetables look jealous. Van Gogh painted like the sun itself had given him caffeine. He created over 200 paintings in just over a year, many of them masterpieces, all of them unapologetically bold. It wasn't just the sunlight that inspired him. He also fell in love with the landscape, the people, and perhaps most of all with the fantasy of creating a community of artists. You see, Vincent didn't just want to paint. He wanted to build a little utopia for like-minded creatives who could live, work, and throw paint at canvases, and occasionally each other in artistic harmony. So he found a house with lemon-yellow walls and rented it. Thus, the Yellow House was born, his personal dream factory, colour laboratory, and social experiment. Unfortunately, this utopia had one serious design flaw. It was only occupied by one very intense redhead and a growing mountain of paintings. But Vincent had plans. Big, ambitious, colour-drenched plans. Enter Paul Gauguin. Now Gauguin was no stranger to art, or to drama. A self-proclaimed visionary, Gauguin was more of a bohemian pirate than a buddy. He liked exotic inspiration, freedom from societal norms, and the occasional philosophical wrestling match. Vincent invited him to join the Yellow House as his creative comrade. It was like asking a bear to move in with a hummingbird. On paper, they were both painters. In reality, their personalities clashed harder than a fuchsia sunset on a neon sign. Still, for a brief shining moment, the bromance bloomed. They painted together, debated fiercely, and shared meals like they were two misunderstood geniuses, building something transcendent. But the cracks began to show fast. Gauguin, ever the alpha painter, was domineering and dismissive. Van Gogh, ever the sensitive soul, internalized every critique like a knife made of paintbrush bristles. The atmosphere inside the Yellow House was less art commune and more creative pressure cooker. Vincent adored Gauguin's talent, but he also feared abandonment. Gogh, for his part, found Vincent's emotional intensity suffocating. It didn't help that Van Gogh was working himself into exhaustion, painting by day, sketching by night, living mostly on bread, coffee, and nerves. The tension simmered until it boiled into something neither could control. Outside the house, things weren't much better. The townspeople of Arles didn't exactly welcome Vincent with open arms. His wild beard, erratic behavior, and habit of talking to himself while painting fields didn't exactly scream upstanding neighbor. Children ran from him, and adults whispered. Eventually, locals would refer to him simply as the red-headed madman. It turns out that walking around in the blazing sun wearing a full suit and painting sunflowers while muttering about light didn't make for the most comforting street presence. But here's the twist. Despite all the tension, Arles became the heart of Van Gogh's legacy. This is where he created his most iconic works. The bedroom, the night cafe, the yellow house, and of course, sunflowers. He painted with feverish devotion, not just because he loved it, but because it felt like the only way to make sense of the world unraveling around him. Painting was how he kept his sanity stitched together. Even as the seams frayed, the relationship with Gogh eventually crumbled, as all overly intense bromances built on clashing egos tend to do. Their final confrontation, emotionally charged and volcanic, would lead directly to Vincent's infamous breakdown. But let's not spoil what's coming. For now, what matters is this. In Arles, Van Gogh exploded onto the canvas in full color, in full chaos, and in full humanity. He painted not what he saw, but what he felt. The swirling, pulsing life beneath the surface of reality. In the blazing yellows and swirling strokes, you can see a man grasping for meaning, holding on to joy with trembling hands, and trying with every ounce of his being to turn sunlight into salvation. By now, Van Gogh was a human roller coaster powered by paint, emotional turbulence, and just enough coffee to fuel a minor revolution. And yet, out of this chaotic swirl of thoughts and feelings, he began producing some of the most emotionally powerful art the world had ever seen. He wasn't just painting anymore. He was unleashing something cosmic, something raw, something that looked at the universe, squinted, and said, "What if I gave this sky a pulse?" Let's begin with the Starry Night, the undisputed heavyweight champion of emotionally charged skies. Vincent painted it in 1889, not from the comfort of a cozy studio or a scenic mountaintop, but from the window of an asylum in Saint Remy de Provence. Not exactly the kind of setting travel influencers recommend. He had voluntarily committed himself there, after one too many mental breakdowns, and one less ear than usual, hoping the quiet might help still the storm in his head. Instead, the storm showed up on the canvas. But the Starry Night wasn't a literal scene. Van Gogh painted it from memory, imagination, and whatever dreams rattled through his sleepless nights. The swirling skies weren't just decorative flair, they were a visual representation of his mind, alive with energy and turbulence. The moon glows like a spotlight. The stars whirl like dancers with zero spatial awareness. The village below sleeps peacefully, unaware of the chaos brewing above it, and that enormous, inky cypress tree in the foreground. It's not just a tree, it's a bridge between earth and sky, life and death, sanity and madness. In other words, your standard subtle metaphor for a man in emotional freefall. But Van Gogh didn't stop at celestial theatrics. He also painted sunflowers. Yes, the famously cheerful golden flowers that have been printed on everything from tote bags to dorm room posters. Yet what people often miss is that Van Gogh wasn't painting these blooms just for aesthetic vibes. He was obsessed with them. To him, sunflowers weren't just plants. They were spiritual companions. They stood tall, even in the heat. They radiated energy. They had the decency to not judge him when he talked to his easel. There are actually multiple sunflowers paintings. He did them as part of a plan to decorate the yellow house, particularly for his pal Gogh's visit, because nothing says welcome to my spiraling mind palace, like 12 blazing yellow sunbursts staring at you while you try to eat dinner. But to Vincent, sunflowers symbolized gratitude and friendship, qualities he craved desperately, even as his relationships crumbled. In each thick brushstroke and layer of paint, there's both celebration and sorrow. Some blooms are fresh, others drooping. The entire bouquet seems to hum with life and quiet decay. Then there's the bedroom, Van Gogh painted his own modest room in Arles, making every object seem a little off-kilter, a little askew, like the whole scene is about to exhale and collapse. The colours clash on purpose. The furniture leans with theatrical awkwardness. It's supposed to be calming, and yet you can feel how lonely it is. He wanted it to symbolise rest, peace, comfort. But what leaks through is how desperately he wanted those things, not necessarily how often he found them. What's unique about Van Gogh's work from this period is not just the vibrant colour or iconic brushwork, it's the urgency. You can almost hear the ticking clock behind each canvas. He painted like someone racing a deadline, only he could see, as if he knew his time was short, and every brushstroke had to mean something. In just over a decade, he produced around 2,100 artworks, 860 of which were oil paintings. That's the kind of output you'd expect from a factory. Not a single, tormented soul working alone in rented rooms and sanitariums. His painting technique itself was as unorthodox as his lifestyle. Van Gogh didn't sketch things out delicately and take weeks to build layers. He attacked the canvas like a man possessed. He painted thick, textured swirls that looked like they were fighting their way into the world. Sometimes he worked so fast, he'd paint over still wet canvases, blending mistakes into genius. He often squeezed paint directly from the tube like it was mustard on a hot dog of raw emotion. And despite the electric brilliance of his work, success continued to elude him. He sold only one painting during his lifetime, The Red Vineyard, for what would today amount to a solid grocery run. The rest? Rejected, dismissed, laughed at. Critics saw him as a lunatic with a brush, not a visionary. But Vincent didn't paint for the critics. He painted because it was the only thing louder than the chaos in his head. There's a reason. The Starry Night, Sunflowers, and The Bedroom still grip people today. They aren't just paintings, they're open letters from a man trying to translate feelings most of us can't name. They speak the language of insomnia, longing, hope, fear, and wonder. Van Gogh painted his truth with no filter, no polish, and no apologies. If Vincent van Gogh's mind were a landscape, it would have looked a lot like one of his paintings, bold, swirling, chaotic, and heartbreakingly beautiful. While art historians can debate brushstrokes and pigments all day, one thing that remains undeniable is that Van Gogh's greatest canvas might have been the one he couldn't hang on a wall, his own mind. Van Gogh's mental struggles weren't just occasional dips in mood or the odd existential crisis. No, this was a full-blown, high-speed rollercoaster without a seatbelt. And the worst part? He was stuck on it alone, in an era where mental health treatment often meant being locked in a room with peeling wallpaper and enough morphine to tranquilize a moose. Psychology in the 1880s was about as precise as trying to treat a migraine with a hammer. By the late 1880s, his symptoms had become impossible to ignore. Hallucinations, blackouts, anxiety attacks, mood swings. Van Gogh was plagued by a relentless storm that no one truly understood, least of all himself. He would write to his brother Theo with a kind of raw, aching vulnerability, trying to explain the turmoil, the ringing in his ears, the sudden depressions, the episodes of confusion. He once described it as a feeling of being sucked into an infinite void, which sounds poetic until you realize he was actually living it. One of the most terrifying aspects of Vincent's condition was the unpredictability. He could be working furiously on a painting, alive with creative energy one moment, and completely incapacitated by despair the next. It was as if his brilliance came with a tax, each masterpiece paid for with days of agony. But unlike other tortured artists who romanticize their suffering, Van Gogh genuinely feared what was happening to him. He didn't embrace the madness, he fought it, tooth and nail. After the infamous ear-cutting episode, yes, the one we've already dissected with surgical precision, Van Gogh realized he needed more than just a new roommate or a change of scenery. In 1889, he voluntarily admitted himself to the Saint-Paul-de-Mausole asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. This wasn't some spa retreat for overworked painters. It was a former monastery turned mental hospital, complete with barred windows and endless echoes of distant screams. Fun place. But here's the astonishing part. Even in this sterile, confining environment, Van Gogh created some of his most powerful work. While other patients struggled to find their footing in reality, Vincent painted his way through the fog. He was allowed access to a small studio in the hospital, and he used it like a man on a mission. Flowers, trees, fields, the hospital garden, all transformed under his brush into vibrant living entities. Nature became his balm, a source of clarity amidst the chaos. He painted over 150 works during his year-long stay. That's more than most painters manage in a decade, let alone while navigating hallucinations and depressive episodes. His work from this period has a certain intensity, like he was clinging to reality by rendering it in oil and pigment. The olive trees he painted twist and writhe, their branches echoing the contortions of his own thoughts. His series of irises and cypresses practically scream with emotion, proof that even in institutional walls, Van Gogh was never creatively imprisoned. He also continued to correspond obsessively with Theo, his brother and lifeline. These letters were more than updates. They were confessionals, soul splashes of a man who had no one else to talk to. Van Gogh's greatest fear was not death, but disconnection. He dreaded the thought that his art, and by extension his suffering, meant nothing to anyone. In one letter, he compared himself to a broken lantern in the dark. "I feel like a broken vessel," he wrote, and you can almost see the paint dripping from the word. But through it all, he clung to art. Painting was his form of self-therapy long before that was a buzzword. He painted not just to express himself, but to understand himself. And although he couldn't afford a therapist, a prescription, or even consistent meals, he did have one powerful tool: his brush. It's hard not to marvel at the resilience. Where many would have collapsed under the weight of such anguish, Van Gogh painted through it, not always well, not always clearly, but always honestly. He was diagnosed with everything from epilepsy to acute mania to generalized insanity, which in 19th century medical terms was basically just a shrug and a head pat. No one had a firm answer. And even today, modern psychologists debate his condition: bipolar disorder, borderline personality, schizophrenia, temporal lobe epilepsy, or some uniquely devastating cocktail of all the above. Whatever it was not poetic, it was not beautiful. But what Van Gogh did with it, that was extraordinary. His madness didn't define his art, but it undeniably shaped it. You don't get sunflowers that radiate like suns or skies that swirl like a Van Halen solo without someone who feels everything 10 times too hard. Vincent didn't paint his illness. He painted through it, and in doing so, he captured emotions most of us struggle to name. Before you picture Van Gogh with his tragic eyes, his floppy hat, and a brush smeared with yellow, picture this: Vincent hunched over a desk, ink-stained fingers, scribbling furiously with the intensity of someone who might combust if he didn't unload his soul onto paper. Because while his paintings gave the world a window into how he saw it, his letters told us how he felt about it. And wow, did he feel a lot. Vincent van Gogh didn't just dabble in correspondence, he was a full-time emotional stenographer, with a side hustle in poetic oversharing. His letters, over 900 survive today, are a masterclass in vulnerability, wit, existential crisis, and the occasional botanical observation that reads like a love poem to a shrub. The vast majority of these letters were sent to his younger brother Theo, the one-man support system who functioned as Vincent's art dealer, therapist, financial sponsor, cheerleader, and crisis hotline operator, all rolled into one. Now, most sibling relationships are built on passive-aggressive jabs and birthday cards that arrive 2 weeks late, but the bond between Vincent and Theo, it was something altogether different. Theo wasn't just his brother, he was the tether keeping Vincent from floating off the edge of his own mind, and Vincent, bless his complicated soul, treated each letter like an emotional life raft. These weren't brief updates like, "Hey Theo, painted some sunflowers, nearly fainted from fumes, hope you're well." No, Vincent's letters were mini-manifestos. Some of them were longer than small novels. They detailed his artistic process, his bouts of depression, his theories about color and composition, his dreams, his failures, his bowel movements. Yes, those too. And his chronic inability to keep a plant alive. Reading them feels like eavesdropping on someone's mind while it's sprinting full speed through a thunderstorm of thoughts. But beyond the angst and intellectual rigor, Vincent's letters had something even more surprising: humor. Yes, the man who painted the weeping willows and the swirling stars was funny. Not sitcom funny, but the dry, self-deprecating kind that only someone deeply aware of their own absurdity could muster. At one point, while trying to describe the state of his art supplies, He complained that everything he touched either broke, spilled, or turned a colour that looked like the inside of a boiled turnip. Another time, he mused that his beard had grown so wild he looked like a biblical figure, minus the wisdom and divine inspiration. Vincent could laugh at himself in the same breath that he lamented his obscurity. He knew he wasn't fashionable. He joked about how Parisians wouldn't hang his work, even if he threw in a free bottle of absinthe. He admitted that his clothes smelled like turpentine and sadness, that his shoes squeaked when he walked, and that most people crossed the street to avoid having to make eye contact with him. It's the kind of humour born from pain, but it's genuine, and it makes him feel human. Through these letters, we learn about the paintings before they were paintings. He describes the fields he wants to capture, the skies he envisions, the way light flickers across a wheat field like it's breathing. He wasn't just slapping paint on canvas, he was narrating a universe, and when you read his words, you realize that each brushstroke was born not just from inspiration, but from deep philosophical reflection. A painting, he once wrote, is not made to decorate rooms, it is an instrument of war. Take that. Throw pillows. Vincent also poured his anxieties into his letters, like a man trying to empty a sinking ship with a teacup. He feared he was a burden. He feared he'd never be good enough. He worried Theo was wasting his time, his money, and his love on someone whose greatest accomplishment was surviving another Tuesday. But beneath all that dread was a flicker of hope. He believed in the power of beauty, even if he couldn't always see it in himself. And through all of this, years of letters across France and the Netherlands, Theo answered, always, sometimes encouraging, sometimes cautious, sometimes gently pushing Vincent to eat something other than bread and despair. Their correspondence wasn't just informative, it was intimate. It was two people trying to hold each other up through the fog of an unforgiving world. Theo kept every one of Vincent's letters. That's not just sibling duty, that's devotion. Today these letters are preserved, studied, quoted, and even published as collections. But to Vincent, they weren't history, they were survival. When the world turned its back on him, when gallery doors stayed shut and wallets stayed closed, those letters were proof that someone was still listening, and perhaps more importantly, that he still had something to say. So next time you see the starry night, remember that behind every swirling star was a man hunched over a desk by candlelight, desperately writing to the one person who believed he mattered. The paintings are what made him immortal, but the letters, that's where you meet the man. If Vincent van Gogh's life had been a painting, it wouldn't be a still life with fruit. It would be more like a chaotic landscape painted during a thunderstorm, while the artist is running low on both paint and will to live. His death, much like his life, has become a story smudged with mystery, myth, and melancholy brushstrokes. It's a tale that, depending on who you ask, is either tragically straightforward or frustratingly mysterious. Either way, it ends the same, with one of history's most brilliant minds gone, and the world not realizing what it had until it was far too late. Let's start with the official version, the one most biographies, museum plaques, and moody documentaries will give you. In July 1890, Van Gogh walked into a wheat field in Arles, a sleepy town outside Paris, where he had been staying under the watchful eye of Dr. Paul Gauchet, a physician who looked so existentially distressed in his own portrait that you'd think he needed the doctor. There, according to the story, Vincent shot himself in the chest with a revolver, not the head. No, he missed every vital organ except the one labelled pain. Then he stumbled back to the inn where he was staying, politely climbed into bed, and spent the next 30 hours slowly dying, reportedly murmuring, La tristesse durera toujours, the sadness will last forever, which, honestly, might be the most poetic mic drop in art history. That's the official account, but if you've made it this far in Van Gogh's story, you know nothing about his life is ever that tidy, because there's a fair bit that doesn't add up. For starters, where's the gun? No one ever found it. Also, the angle of the wound was odd, as if it had come from a distance or a strange angle, not the kind of shot you'd expect from someone trying to end their life. And then there's this: by all accounts, in the weeks before his death, Vincent seemed better, not cured, not dancing in the fields, but better. He was painting prolifically, almost one painting per day. He had reconnected with Theo and adored Theo's newborn son, named after him. He was excited about his new surroundings. His letters, while still full of brooding reflection, it was Van Gogh, after all, were tinged with a glimmer of hope. Not the kind of stuff you'd expect from someone about to give up. So naturally, the plot thickens faster than linseed oil in a cold studio. Enter the alternative theories. One of the most widely discussed came decades later, and involves two teenage boys in the village. According to this theory, the boys, who were known to play with a malfunctioning revolver and had a fondness for pestering the eccentric painter, may have accidentally shot Van Gogh in the field. Vincent, ever the tortured saint, allegedly took the blame to protect them. "Don't accuse anyone," he reportedly told the police. That's either a profound act of forgiveness or the final twist in a real-life episode of Unsolved Mysteries, Impressionist edition. Whether it was suicide, accident, or an act of mercy gone sideways, the result was the same. On July 29th, 1890, Vincent van Gogh died in his small rented room, cradled by the same sadness that had followed him for most of his life. Theo was there, and within 6 months, he too would die, grief-stricken, physically ailing, and emotionally obliterated. Their deaths were like twin brushstrokes fading off the canvas. And then, the world woke up. Here's the kicker. During his lifetime, Van Gogh sold maybe one painting. One. It's the kind of stat that makes modern artists cringe into their avocado toast. He had been mocked, misunderstood, and mostly ignored. But after his death, something shifted. It started with Theo's wife, Johanna van Gogh Bonga, who refused to let Vincent's legacy vanish into the attic. She preserved his letters, promoted his work, and gradually, people started to see what had been there all along. Genius, raw, and unfiltered. Over the next few decades, Van Gogh's art became the definition of posthumous success. Museums scrambled for his work. Art collectors drooled. His paintings now sell for millions. Portrait of Dr. Gache, over $80 million. Iraces, also tens of millions. The Red Vineyard, the one painting he sold in his life, now priceless. It's the most bittersweet irony imaginable. The man who died in obscurity is now so famous that his name is practically shorthand for tragic genius. But maybe that's what makes the mystery of his death linger. It's not just about who fired the shot. It's about how someone so talented, so deeply feeling, could live and die without the world ever really seeing him. And maybe it's also about how his work, once dismissed as the fevered scribbles of a madman, became some of the most beloved images ever created. Swirling skies, golden fields, silent sunflowers. In the end, whether it was self-inflicted or the result of a tragic accident, Vincent van Gogh's death wasn't the end of his story. It was the ignition of his myth. A myth painted in broad, bold strokes. Messy, yes, but unforgettable. When Vincent van Gogh died in 1890, he was not exactly trending. He wasn't even a footnote in the art world. If anything, he was known more for being that unstable guy who mutilated his ear than for his swirling skies or blazing sunflowers. His funeral wasn't packed with critics or collectors. There was no emotional montage of his greatest works. No auctions, no glowing eulogies in the Paris Review. Just a few friends, some confused townsfolk, and a room filled with paintings nobody seemed to want. Fast forward to today, and Van Gogh is everywhere. He's in museums, mugs, memes, and even mass-produced yoga mats. There are immersive Van Gogh experiences, where people pay good money to stand in a room full of projected brushstrokes and feel cultured. You can buy socks with Starry Night on them, and tote bags covered in sunflowers. The man who couldn't get anyone to take his work seriously is now one of the most famous artists in human history. He went from invisible to inescapable, which is, frankly, the most Van Gogh thing that could have happened. But how did that happen? The answer begins with Theo's widow, Johanna van Gogh Bonga. If Theo had been Vincent's emotional lifeline during his life, Johanna became his voice after death. She inherited hundreds of Vincent's letters and paintings, and unlike most of the art establishment, she didn't see them as the erratic products of a mentally ill recluse. She saw genius, and she made it her life's mission to share it. She translated and published Vincent's letters, revealing not just a tormented artist, but a profoundly thoughtful, often poetic soul. Suddenly, people weren't just seeing weird swirls and thick blobs of paint. They were seeing Vincent, the human being behind the brush. His letters peeled back the myth and exposed the man, vulnerable, funny, passionate, and deeply aware of the beauty and brutality of the world around him. As the 20th century rolled on, critics began to take notice. Art historians started whispering phrases like ahead of his time and revolutionary. Exhibitions popped up. The Impressionists had opened the door, but Van Gogh had kicked it off the hinges. By mid-century, he was considered a master. By the 1980s, he was a superstar. And in the world of art, superstardom means one thing: money. Paintings that couldn't sell for a loaf of bread during his lifetime were now going for tens of millions. In 1990, exactly a century after his death, Portrait of Dr. Gogh sold for $82.50 million, a sum so large that somewhere in the afterlife, Vincent probably raised an eyebrow and said, "Seriously, that guy?" His other works, like irises and sunflowers, followed suit. The starving artist had become a posthumous cash cow. But it's not just about the money. Van Gogh became more than just an artist. He became a symbol of the tortured genius, of misunderstood brilliance, of beauty emerging from madness. He's the poster child for every high school student who draws in the margins of their notebook and dreams of being discovered posthumously, though hopefully with both ears intact. In popular culture, Van Gogh is the tragic hero we love to romanticize. He's shown up in movies, music, television, and even Doctor Who, where an episode titled Vincent and the Doctor gave us one of the most emotional fictional tributes ever aired. Try watching that museum scene without sobbing into your sketchbook. Go on, I dare you. Musicians have written ballads about him. Don McLean's Vincent's Starry, Starry Night painted an aching tribute to the man who suffered for his sanity. The song turned him into a soft-voiced saint of sorrow. Never mind the fact that Van Gogh could also be hilariously sarcastic and wrote letters full of dry, self-deprecating humor. Those don't make it into the Spotify playlist. Even psychology has tried to lay claim to him. Scholars have debated his mental health diagnoses for years. Was it bipolar disorder, temporal lobe epilepsy, borderline personality disorder, lead poisoning from his paint, or all of the above, with a splash of cosmic, existential dread? Whatever the diagnosis, Van Gogh's inner torment has become part of the brand, because what's a legendary artist without a little tragedy? Ironically, the very thing that destroyed Van Gogh's life, his inability to connect with a world that didn't understand him, became the engine of his legacy. Today, millions of people line up to see his paintings, to walk through his recreated bedroom in the Van Gogh's museum, to weep under his brushstrokes. But it's not just about the art, it's about the man, the one who never stopped painting, even when the world stopped caring. So yes, Van Gogh is worth millions now. His name is on coffee mugs, his brushwork is projected onto ceilings, and his paintings are discussed by art students with tortured expressions and large scarves. But perhaps the biggest legacy is this: Vincent van Gogh reminded us that sometimes greatness isn't recognized in its own time, that pain and beauty can coexist, that even when you're misunderstood, unseen, and struggling to stay afloat, your work can still ripple out across time. Not bad for a guy who once traded his paintings for food and didn't live long enough to see a single retrospective. Before Oscar Wilde could devastate drawing rooms with one-liners sharper than a stiletto heel, he was just a curious Irish boy growing up in a house that practically screamed, "We are not like the other families." And oh, they weren't. Born on October 16th, 1854, in Dublin, Ireland, Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. Yes, that is his full name. And no, he didn't come out of the womb quoting Shakespeare, but give it time, arrived in a household that was already halfway to legend. His father, Sir William Wilde, was an esteemed ear and eye doctor, part-time antiquarian, and full-time eccentric. The man could examine your cornea while lecturing you about Celtic ruins. He also fathered at least 3 illegitimate children, which Victorian society politely swept under the rug, right next to all the illegitimate emotions. His mother, Jane Wilde, known by her pen name Speranza, was a fire-breathing nationalist poet, political radical, and a woman who could crush your ego with a sonnet. Jane wrote fierce, dramatic verse supporting Irish independence, while hosting salons that combined high tea with higher drama. She also dressed in flowing garments, spoke in quotations, and raised her children to believe they were destined for greatness, or at the very least, fabulousness. Little Oscar soaked it all in like a decorative sponge in a gilded punch bowl. From an early age, he marinated in poetry, politics, and passive-aggressive witticisms. He could quote Latin before he could probably spell mud, and his bedtime stories involved tales of rebellion, myth, and heroic tragedy, all delivered with the intensity of an opera in a thunderstorm. But young Oscar didn't just inherit his mother's flair for the dramatic or his father's love of the past. He took those raw materials and crafted himself into a living artwork. He wasn't like the other children, and he absolutely leaned into it. He had a taste for elegance, an ear for rhythm, and an instinct for performance. One could imagine baby Oscar crawling out of his cradle, appraising the wallpaper, and requesting something with more Greek columns. At Portora Royal School, a rather stiff and proper place for stiff and proper boys, Oscar stood out like a flamingo at a chess tournament. While others played sports, he read Greek tragedies and pondered aesthetic theory. He once earned a nickname from classmates, Oscar the Woman. It was intended as an insult, but Wilde, in typical Wilde fashion, probably took it as a compliment and wrote a poem about it on scented paper. More than anything, Oscar became obsessed with beauty, not in the shallow, put a filter on it way, but in the philosophical, borderline religious sense. He believed in beauty as salvation, as the ultimate goal of life. If something wasn't beautiful, it was barely worth existing. Imagine a teenager declaring war on ugliness while wearing an embroidered cravat. And you're halfway there. This obsession wasn't merely aesthetic, it was existential. Beauty, language, art. These weren't hobbies for Oscar, they were how he made sense of the world. While his peers prepared for predictable careers, Oscar envisioned himself as a glowing contradiction, a prophet of pleasure in a grey, morally upright society. He began dabbling in writing early, penning poems with a kind of flourish that made teenage heartbreaks feel like epic operas. His early work was earnest, overly adorned, and about as subtle as a chandelier dropped from the ceiling, but it hinted at the genius to come. You could already hear the gears turning in his brain, each one dipped in irony and polished with satire. Family dinners in the Wilde household must have been an absolute circus. Picture it. Sir William debating ancient Irish architecture, Jane reciting revolutionary poetry while holding a teacup like a weapon, and Oscar dramatically describing a particularly radiant cloud formation as though it had just changed his life. Most families argue about who left the back door open. The Wildes debated aesthetic morality. Oscar Wilde's beginnings weren't humble. They were hilariously over the top in a way that shaped him into the literary firecracker he would become. With one foot in high society and the other in Irish rebellion, he learned early that life was a stage, and he'd be damned if he wasn't the star, the director, and the set designer all at once. In the end, the birth of a dandy wasn't just about lace collars and poetic sighs. It was the start of a revolution disguised in velvet. Wilde didn't emerge from his youth polished. He emerged theatrical, a boy who looked at the world and decided that truth might be important. But if it wasn't beautiful, he'd rather rewrite it with better lighting. If Dublin was where Oscar Wilde was born, then Oxford was where Oscar Wilde happened. Loudly, flamboyantly, and preferably in velvet slippers. By the time he strolled into Magdalen College in 1874, Wilde wasn't there to blend in. He was there to reinvent the concept of a university student, preferably while quoting Greek poetry and accessorizing with lilies. Let's be clear, Oxford in the Victorian era was not a place known for encouraging eccentricity. It was a fortress of tradition, steeped in dusty classics and fueled by tweed. But Wilde took one look at all that repressed grey and decided it needed a little colour, possibly chartreuse. He didn't just attend Oxford, he performed it. He wasn't the best behaved student, understatement, nor the most disciplined understatement. But he was brilliant. He read compulsively, wrote obsessively, and questioned everything with the kind of confidence usually reserved for men twice his age and half as sparkly. He won prestigious prizes like the Newdigate Prize for Poetry, which is Oxford speak for we don't usually like flamboyant peacocks, but this one writes very well. Oscar became a disciple of the aesthetic movement, a philosophy that basically screamed, art doesn't need to be useful, Karen. It just needs to be beautiful. This idea, art for art's sake, wasn't just an intellectual theory for Wilde, It was a lifestyle. He didn't wear clothes. He curated outfits. He didn't write papers. He composed verbal tapestries laced with references to Greek myth, Renaissance art, and obscure botanical metaphors. While most students were debating theology or stumbling into lectures hungover, Wilde was crafting his public persona like it was a sculpture made of lace and sarcasm. He decorated his room with blue china, peacock feathers, and sunflowers, because of course he did. He once said, "I find it harder and harder every day to live up to my blue china." And he wasn't kidding. He also developed a talent for turning lectures into performance art. Picture it. While stodgy professors droned on about moral rectitude, Wilde would sit in the front row in a velvet jacket, scribbling witticisms in the margins of Plato, and occasionally raising his hand to ask questions that made everyone uncomfortable, confused, or slightly more fabulous. At a time when Oxford students were expected to grow up into well-behaved judges, clergymen, or repressed bank managers, Wilde threw a jeweled wrench into the system. He wanted to be seen, adored, and talked about. He was a walking contradiction, utterly intellectual yet theatrically vain, as invested in Greek philosophy as he was in the proper drape of a cravat. Naturally, he developed a following. Other students either admired him, mocked him, or nervously invited him to parties because he might say something unforgettable and vaguely insulting. Wilde didn't just read about Socrates. He essentially became Socrates. If Socrates had been obsessed with the right shade of lavender and had an opinion on which wine paired best with poetry. But make no mistake, beneath the peacocking and clever repartee was a fiercely ambitious mind. Wilde may have played the fool in social circles, but he was cunning with his career. He knew that being talked about, even scandalously, was a form of power. Long before TikTok made being extra a career path, Wilde had already mastered it at Oxford. His wit sharpened during these years into something almost dangerous, equal parts charm and critique. He could eviscerate an argument with a single sentence, and still have room left for a pun. Professors would praise his essays while also wondering if they'd just been gently roasted by a student with better hair than them. And then there were the theatrics. Wilde treated conversation like stage dialogue, and stage dialogue like sacred scripture. He once said, "I never travel without my diary. One should always have something sensational to read on the train." He wasn't just living life, he was writing it, one quip at a time. By the time he left Oxford, Oscar Wilde had transformed himself into a living contradiction, a rebel who craved applause, a dandy with a philosopher's mind, and a future literary legend who could deliver biting critiques of British society while wearing a silk boutonniere. Oxford tried to mould Wilde into a proper gentleman scholar. Instead, Wilde moulded Oxford into a backdrop for his origin story, the place where the performance began, and the man behind the legend took centre stage. If Oxford was where Oscar Wilde learned to be Oscar Wilde, then the years after were when he decided to take that sparkling persona public and turn it into a full-blown brand. Because let's be honest, Oscar didn't just want to be famous, he wanted to be unforgettable. The kind of guy whose name alone made people smirk, raise an eyebrow, or double-check their own outfits. After leaving the cloistered halls of Oxford, Wilde didn't retreat to a quiet life of scholarly writing or polite society events. Nope, he dove headfirst into the Victorian public sphere, like it was a glitter-filled pool, and he was the only one with a velvet swimsuit. What set Wilde apart wasn't just his brilliance or literary talent, but his ability to perform himself as an art piece. He didn't just live life, he lived it extravagantly. By the 1880s, Wilde's name was no longer whispered just in literary circles or Oxford lecture halls. It was on the lips of London's social elite, the bohemians of Paris, and even, surprisingly, the cowboys of the American West. Yes, you heard that right. Oscar Wilde, the dandy with a penchant for peacock feathers and polished boots, took his act across the Atlantic to the United States in 1882. And if you're picturing him trading witticisms over campfires with rugged cowboys, you're almost right, except Oscar was roasting them in velvet and lace. Wilde's American lecture tour was part cultural ambassador, part vaudeville show, and part high society roast session. His topic was the English Renaissance of art, but his real specialty was delivering aphorisms so sharp you could cut through the thickest mustache wax with them. Wilde was not just a lecturer, he was a walking, talking quotation machine. It wasn't unusual for the crowd to laugh until they cried, or squint suspiciously at their own sense of humor. Imagine cowboys in dusty boots and wide-brimmed hats, staring at a man dressed like a Shakespearean dandy, dripping in velvet and silk, casually dismantling their frontier cliches with lines like, "I can resist everything except temptation." It was scandalous, confusing, and utterly captivating. Wilde brought a touch of European flamboyance to the rugged, rough-and-tumble American psyche, and somehow the audiences ate it up. But Wilde's real genius wasn't just his charm or outrageous wardrobe. It was how he turned wit into branding. Before personal branding was a buzzword slapped on every influencer's Instagram bio, Wilde was living proof it could be an art form. His signature style, both sartorial and verbal, became his trademark. He wasn't just writing plays and essays, he was cultivating a public persona so vivid it overshadowed almost everything else. Oscar Wilde had mastered the art of being quoted. His lines spread like wildfire, passed from salon to pub, from society gossip to print media. To lose one parent may be regarded as a misfortune, to lose both looks like carelessness. I have the simplest tastes, I am always satisfied with the best. Each quote was like a jewel in his crown, glittering with a blend of wisdom, satire, and cheeky self-awareness. His flamboyant fashion sense was no accident either. Wilde famously said, "A little sincerity is a dangerous thing, and a great deal of it is absolutely fatal." So he opted for the great deal of sincerity through his outward appearance. Ruffles, velvet jackets, silk cravats, a lily pinned to his lapel. The man was a one-person parade, a living contradiction to the stiff, Victorian propriety around him. This flair wasn't just about looking good. It was a strategic performance of identity. Wilde understood that in a world obsessed with appearances and social standing, being memorable was key. He turned himself into a spectacle, the ultimate dandy who wielded fashion and language like weapons of mass distraction. People didn't just listen to Wilde, they watched him, and sometimes that was the whole point. Back in London, his social life became a whirlwind of glittering parties, literary salons, and cutting remarks. Wilde's witty insults were legendary. He could destroy reputations with a single bon mot, while still managing to smile charmingly, as if he'd just complimented you on your tie. His conversations were theatrical performances, his gestures calculated yet seemingly effortless. Despite the public adoration, Wilde was also a master of self-deprecation. Beneath the velvet and wit was a man who knew the precariousness of fame and the loneliness it sometimes bred. He once quipped, "The only thing to do with good advice is to pass it on. It is never any use to oneself." It was his way of reminding everyone, including himself, that charm and intellect could sometimes be a mask for vulnerability. By the mid-1880s, Oscar Wilde was no longer just a playwright or poet. He was a celebrity phenomenon. His name was synonymous with brilliance and flamboyance, and he had built a reputation as much for his personality as for his art. He wasn't merely living in the spotlight. He was dancing in it, twirling with a smirk and a witty retort at the ready. This transformation into a public figure set the stage for the next act of Wilde's life, the one where the spotlight would burn even hotter, and the consequences of his dazzling persona would be as dramatic as any play he ever wrote. Oscar Wilde didn't just want to be known as a dazzling conversationalist or the man who made velvet fashionable. He wanted to leave a mark that would outlive even his most outrageous outfit choices, and so he turned to writing, where his razor-sharp wit and love of paradox found their perfect home. Wilde's literary career was a dazzling parade of success, scandal, and subtle social sabotage, all wrapped up in beautifully crafted sentences that could charm the birds out of the trees, or sting the most polished aristocrat. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, Wilde was hitting his stride as a playwright and author, producing works that are still quoted, performed and admired today. One of his most famous plays, The Importance of Being Earnest, is a sparkling comedy of manners that doesn't just make you laugh, it makes you think about the absurdities of Victorian society while you're at it. Wilde's genius lay in how he turned the rigid social codes of his time into a playground for his satire. The play's very title is a delicious pun, because in Wilde's world, being earnest was less about sincerity and more about ridiculous pretense. But Wilde didn't stop at just entertaining the upper classes. He held up a mirror to society, and that mirror wasn't always flattering. Through his characters, Wilde exposed the hypocrisies, the double standards, and the petty vanities of the social elite, all while delivering punchlines so sharp they could slice through the thickest layers of Victorian decorum. It was a risky move, like juggling knives while dressed in silk, beautiful, captivating, and definitely dangerous, and danger was part of Wilde's appeal. Take The Picture of Dorian Gray, his only novel, published in 1890. On the surface, it's a Gothic tale about vanity, youth, and corruption, a man who sells his soul so his portrait ages instead of him. But beneath the surface, it was a scandalous commentary on morality, hedonism, and the darker side of human nature. The novel ruffled feathers because it seemed to celebrate a life of pleasure without consequences, a message that made the prudish Victorian critics clutch their pearls and clutch their copies of the Times. Wilde's fiction was like a flirtation with danger, charming, seductive, and just scandalous enough to make people whisper behind their fans. His prose shimmered with elegance, but the themes cut deep. He didn't just write stories. He threw society's sacred cows into the arena and watched the chaos unfold. His work was the ultimate social critique, disguised as entertainment. Think of it as the Victorian version of roasting the establishment on late-night TV, but with more corsets and fewer commercials. What made Wilde truly revolutionary was his skill in turning offence into art. Instead of preaching or moralizing, he laughed at society's stuffiness and hypocrisy, daring his audiences to do the same. When he poked fun at social conventions, he wasn't just being cheeky, he was holding up a mirror and daring people to face their own contradictions. It's like he handed society a mirror and said, "Look how ridiculous you really are," all while twirling a cane and tipping an impossibly wide-brimmed hat. His plays were the social events of their day, attended by London's elite, who came for the entertainment, but often left feeling uncomfortably exposed. Wilde had perfected the art of combining charm and critique, so his audiences laughed at themselves even as they were being roasted. That's no easy trick, making people chuckle while questioning their own morals and manners. It's the literary equivalent of slipping a whoopee cushion onto the throne of Victorian propriety. Wilde's writing wasn't just about poking fun, though. There was genuine artistry in his wordplay, his careful construction of dialogue, and his deep understanding of human nature. He wrote like a man who saw life as a stage where everyone played roles, some ridiculous, some tragic, all worthy of observation, and a good joke. His wit was like a secret handshake among the cultured elite, a way to communicate truths that couldn't be spoken aloud without causing a scandal. Of course, Wilde's fearless social commentary didn't come without consequences. The very people he skewered and entertained also started to see him as a threat. The same society that applauded his brilliance began to view his humour as a challenge to their authority and morality. And when you're a man who dresses like a peacock and uses words like daggers, enemies are almost inevitable. But Wilde embraced the controversy like a true artist. He knew that provoking outrage was part of the price for brilliance. His writing wasn't just literature, it was a performance, a social experiment, and sometimes a battle cry. With every line he pushed boundaries, questioned norms, and invited readers to laugh, even if the laughter sometimes hid discomfort. In the end, Wilde's literary legacy isn't just about his plays or his novel. It's about how he used his art to challenge the status quo with humour, style, and a razor-sharp tongue. He turned writing into a weapon and a dance, all at once. And in doing so, he carved a permanent place in history as the man who could make you laugh, think, and squirm in your velvet gloves, often all at the same time. If Oscar Wilde's life was a play, then the entrance of Lord Alfred Douglas, affectionately and often sarcastically called Bosie, was the moment the plot twisted into high drama, complete with all the flair, passion, and inevitable tragedy you'd expect from a Victorian soap opera. Their relationship wasn't just a love affair. It was a flamboyant, toxic whirlwind that practically screamed, "Keep your corsets on, London. This one's going to get messy." Wilde was no stranger to attention, but Bosie was a whole new kind of spotlight, young, handsome, and headstrong enough to make a hurricane look like a gentle breeze. The two met in the early 1890s, and it wasn't long before Wilde found himself hopelessly entangled in a romance that challenged every social convention of the time. Remember, this was a period when Victorian society was about as tolerant as a cat in a bathtub. especially regarding same-sex relationships. So Wilde's affection for Bosie was about as welcome as a fox at a hen party. Bosie was many things: charming, reckless, and endlessly dramatic. Basically the human equivalent of a glitter bomb. Their relationship was marked by intense passion, but also by fights that could have powered a dozen operas. Wilde adored Bosie's youthful energy and devil-may-care attitude, while Bosie was equally fascinated by Wilde's wit, intellect, and unapologetic flamboyance. Together they were a combustible mix of love, ego, and endless drama. Their romance was lived out publicly, not quietly tucked away in drawing rooms. Wilde was a master of spectacle, and Bosie was happy to play the role of devoted muse and tempestuous lover. They exchanged letters that could rival the scripts of any modern-day reality TV show, full of sass, longing, insults, and that particular Wildean wit that made every sentence sparkle with double meanings and subtle jabs. If you ever needed proof that Victorian gentlemen could throw shade like prose, just peek at these letters. But the love story was far from a fairy tale. Bosie's father, the Marquess of Queensberry, was a man with a reputation for bluntness and little patience for his son's scandalous choices. He saw Wilde as a corrupting influence, and wasn't shy about letting the world know. The Marquess left Wilde an infamous calling card, which read, "For Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." Yes, a misspelling of sodomite, because even insults had to be flamboyant in those days. So this moment was basically the Victorian equivalent of throwing a live grenade into Wilde's life. What followed was a legal and social storm that would become one of the most infamous trials in literary history. Wilde, who had spent years charming and mocking the establishment, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of their full fury. But before we get to the courtroom drama, let's savour the love letters. These weren't just soppy notes, they were razor sharp, dripping with sarcasm and passion, showcasing Wilde's talent for turning personal pain into art. In one letter, Wilde wrote to Bosie, "I have really enjoyed our last encounter, for there is no mistake about it. You are a perfect little demon. Charming, right?" The letters reveal a relationship full of contradictions, deep affection mixed with fierce arguments, moments of tenderness shattered by bursts of jealousy and bitterness. It's like watching a soap opera unfold in ink, with Wilde's language as flamboyant as his wardrobe. The affair was also a risky rebellion against a society that demanded silence and conformity. Wilde's open love for Bosie was a challenge to the strict moral codes of the time, and the consequences were severe. But Wilde didn't retreat. Instead, he embraced the scandal with his usual wit and panache. Even as the walls closed in, their love affair was a wild dance of beauty and destruction, an intense, all-consuming relationship that fueled Wilde's creativity, but also sowed the seeds of his downfall. Bosie's impulsiveness and Wilde's own defiance created a perfect storm, one that would soon drag them both into the harsh glare of public scrutiny and legal peril. This chapter of Wilde's life is a reminder that behind the glittering epigrams and dazzling performances was a man grappling with deep personal desires in a world that offered little mercy. The romance with Bosie wasn't just about love, it was a bold act of living authentically, even when authenticity was punished by society's cruelest laws. Wilde's letters to Bosie remain some of the most intimate and revealing documents of his life, showing not only a tender and passionate lover, but also a brilliant mind wrestling with his place in the world. They are filled with humour, irony, and moments of heartbreaking vulnerability, all wrapped in Wilde's signature style that turns even tragedy into something beautifully theatrical. In the end, the story of Wilde and Bosie is a dazzling, tragic dance of love, defiance, and the high cost of being true to oneself in an unforgiving era. Their affair lit up the Victorian world like a flash of lightning, brilliant, brief, and impossible to ignore. Oscar Wilde's life took a turn so dramatic it could have been penned by Shakespeare himself. Except this time it was real, and the stakes were painfully high. What started as a libel suit intended to silence an enemy swiftly morphed into the trial of the century, turning Wilde from London's beloved witty dandy into a symbol of scandal and disgrace. The whole mess began with a simple but ill-advised decision. Wilde sued Lord Alfred Douglas's father, the Marquess of Queensberry, for libel. The Marquess had accused Wilde of posing as a sodomite, which in Victorian England was more than just a personal insult. It was a criminal accusation punishable by prison. Wilde, confident in his social standing, and armed with his razor-sharp wit, decided to take the fight to court. It was a bold move, almost like challenging a lion to a battle of wits, while wearing a suit made of meat. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. Wilde's lawsuit backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing the Marquis, it opened the floodgates for a devastating investigation into Wilde's private life. The Marquis's legal team, smelling blood, began gathering evidence and testimony that painted Wilde as not just a social deviant but a criminal under the strict laws of the time. Suddenly, the man who had so often mocked society's hypocrisies found himself at the mercy of the very machine he had once skewered with satire. The trial was a media circus. Newspapers devoured every salacious detail, turning the courtroom into a theatre of public spectacle. Wilde's flamboyant personality, once celebrated for its charm and brilliance, was now twisted into proof of moral decay. Headlines screamed scandal, and society's judgment was swift and merciless. The same crowds who had applauded his plays and admired his fashion now whispered behind his back and pointed fingers in the streets. Courtroom scenes from this era could give any modern drama a run for its money. Wilde, always a master of language, attempted to defend himself with eloquence and humour, but the weight of Victorian morality was crushing. The prosecution presented witnesses who testified to Wilde's alleged indiscretions, turning intimate moments into public evidence. The courtroom became a battleground between Wilde's wit and society's rigid rules. One of the most heart-rending aspects of the trial was seeing Wilde's pride wrestle with the reality of his situation. Known for his sharp tongue and quick comebacks, he now faced a legal system that didn't just want to humiliate him but to destroy him. The trial wasn't just about facts, it was about crushing a symbol of non-conformity, a warning to anyone daring to defy the era's strict codes. The Victorian court was relentless. Wilde was eventually convicted of gross indecency, a catch-all charge used to prosecute homosexual acts, which were illegal at the time. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour, a brutal punishment designed to break both body and spirit. It was a tragic irony that the man who had dazzled society with wit and beauty would be broken down by its cruelty. Wilde's imprisonment was harrowing. He went from the glittering salons of London to the grim reality of a prison cell. The transformation was as shocking as it was heartbreaking. Yet, even in confinement, Wilde's spirit flickered with defiant brilliance. His famous poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, emerged from this dark period, a raw and poignant critique of the justice system that had so ruthlessly condemned him. The trial and its aftermath marked a devastating fall from grace. Wilde's career was destroyed, his reputation tarnished beyond repair in his lifetime, and his personal relationships suffered irreparably. Yet, amidst the public humiliation and personal loss, Wilde's story is also one of resilience, of a man who refused to apologize for being himself, even when society demanded silence. This episode in Wilde's life exposes the stark contrast between the vibrant persona he cultivated and the harsh realities he faced. It's a story of how society can elevate a figure to celebrity status, only to cast them down when they refuse to conform. Wilde's trials revealed not just his personal vulnerabilities but the brutal intolerance of the age. So, what can we take away from this chapter of Oscar Wilde's life? It's a cautionary tale about pride, society's double standards, and the cost of defiance. Wilde's legal battles were not just about a man and his love, but about an entire culture grappling with change, identity, and fear of the unfamiliar. And while the courtroom drama may have ended in defeat, the legend of Oscar Wilde only grew stronger in the decades that followed, his words, wit, and courage outlasting the harshest judgments of his time. Imagine trading your velvet suits, silk cravats, and carefully coiffed hair for prison garb, cold stone walls, and beds so hard you start to question if anyone actually sleeps in them, or if they're just there to remind you that comfort is a luxury you've been sentenced to forget. This was the harsh reality Oscar Wilde faced when he was sent to Reading Gaol in 1895, beginning a 2-year sentence of hard labour that would test not only his body, but the very core of his spirit. Reading Gaol wasn't some cushy Victorian country club with occasional poetry readings and afternoon teas. Nope, it was the opposite. The pillows were basically rocks wrapped in cloth, designed more to torture your sleep than offer any kind of comfort. Sympathy, outlawed, kindness, suspicious. In this grim environment, Wilde found himself stripped not just of freedom, but of the very things that made life beautiful: luxury, art, and the company of friends. Yet, amid the drudgery and bleakness, Wilde's brilliant mind refused to be crushed. Prison life was brutal. Hard labor meant long hours, doing physically demanding work, often breaking stones or turning a crank for hours on end. Wilde's delicate frame, accustomed to salons and intellectual sparring, was forced to endure manual labor alongside men who probably didn't know the meaning of the word dandy. The prison routine was strict and dehumanizing, designed to break the will of inmates and erase their individuality. For Wilde, a man who had built his life on beauty, wit, and flamboyance, this was the ultimate punishment. But Wilde was not just a man. He was a force of nature, and even in confinement, he turned pain into art. During these bleak years, he wrote De Profundis, a long, deeply personal letter addressed to his former lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. But De Profundis was more than just a love letter. It was a profound meditation on suffering, forgiveness, and spiritual growth. Wilde reflected on his downfall, his mistakes, and the cruel hand fate had dealt him. But he also revealed a surprising acceptance and even a certain dignity amidst the despair. This writing wasn't an easy exercise in victimhood or self-pity. Instead, Wilde's words crackled with the same razor-sharp intelligence and wit that had once made him the darling of London's high society. De Profundis laid bare the emotional and psychological toll of his imprisonment, but also offered a glimpse of hope, a belief that suffering, while brutal, could also be transformative. Wilde's time in Reading Gaol also forced him to confront the ugliness of the world head-on, a stark contrast to his lifelong obsession with beauty and aesthetics. He, who had spent years dressing like a peacock and decorating his life with art and poetry, had to survive in a place where ugliness wasn't just a metaphor, but the daily reality. Cold stone cells, harsh guards, and fellow prisoners hardened by their own stories of misfortune. The jail stripped away all pretenses and left only raw humanity, sometimes brutal, sometimes strangely kind. Yet, even in this worst of places, Wilde found moments of connection. He became aware of the shared suffering of his fellow inmates, men broken by poverty, addiction, or bad luck. His poetic soul recognized the universal pain that unites us all, rich or poor, free or confined. This empathy enriched his writing and gave the Ballad of Reading Gaol its haunting power. The poem, written after his release, is a grim but beautiful elegy to a fellow prisoner executed during Wilde's sentence, a stark reminder of mortality and the fragile line between freedom and captivity. Wilde's prison experience also transformed how he viewed himself and his legacy. The man who had once dazzled salons with witty aphorisms was now a figure of tragedy and endurance. His laughter and sarcasm, once weapons of social commentary, became tools for survival, deflecting despair and asserting his dignity against a system designed to erase him. So, how does a man who lived for beauty survive in the ugliest place imaginable? Wilde did it by turning inward and finding a new kind of beauty in resilience, truth, and even in suffering itself. The prison walls may have been cold and unyielding, but Wilde's spirit, while battered, was far from broken. His time in Reading Gaol marks one of the most poignant chapters in the story of a man who lived loudly, loved boldly, and fell spectacularly. It's a chapter that reminds us how even in the darkest hours the human spirit can create light, and that sometimes the hardest beds can inspire the deepest poetry. When Oscar Wilde was finally released from Reading Gaol in 1897, he was a free man on paper but a prisoner of circumstance and shattered health in reality. The man who once strode through London's salons in velvet and silk was now a shadow of his former self. His flamboyance faded, his spirit bruised but not completely extinguished. Wilde's release didn't mark a triumphant return to society, far from it. Instead, it began a painful chapter of exile, regret, and quiet reflection, spent mostly under assumed names and away from the city that had adored and then rejected him. Wilde's health had taken a catastrophic hit during those 2 years behind bars. The harsh prison conditions had drained him physically and mentally. His once vibrant complexion was now pale, his body gaunt, and his mind weighed down by the trauma of public disgrace. The freedom he gained was bittersweet. He had lost nearly everything that had defined him: his social circle, his reputation, and the life of ease and beauty he had cultivated with such care. Worse still, the Victorian society that once celebrated his wit now looked at him with cold judgment and scorn. To avoid the prying eyes and whispered gossip that followed him like a persistent shadow, Wilde chose exile in France, where he lived in relative obscurity. He adopted pseudonyms like Sebastian Melmoth, a name that cleverly fused the idea of wandering outcast. Melmoth, the Wanderer, was a Gothic novel about a man cursed to roam the earth forever. It was a fitting alias for a man who found himself wandering through Europe, a brilliant mind adrift, trying to escape the scandal that had consumed his life. In this self-imposed exile, Wilde grappled with loneliness and regret. He was a man who had once basked in the spotlight, but now found himself cloaked in anonymity, stripped of the adoration that had fueled his ego. Friends were scarce, and many who had once praised him kept their distance to avoid tarnishing their own reputations. Yet, Wilde's resilience was quietly evident. He didn't vanish into obscurity completely. Instead, he channeled his pain into his writing, producing works that were tinged with melancholy, but still rich with his signature wit and insight. Among these post-prison writings were poignant reflections on suffering, beauty, and the human condition, an echo of the lessons forged in the crucible of his imprisonment. Wilde's style evolved, becoming more introspective, but no less sharp. His letters and essays from this period reveal a man who had seen the darkest corners of life, but still retained a spark of humor and a biting intellect. In a way, these works serve as a bridge between the dazzling Wilde of his youth and the tragic figure who emerged after his fall. Friendships, though fewer, also lingered. A handful of loyal companions and admirers stood by Wilde during this bleak period, offering moments of warmth in a cold world. Some of these relationships were unconventional, built not on the glamour of society, but on genuine affection and shared understanding of suffering. These connections provided Wilde with a fragile lifeline to a world that had largely turned its back on him. Yet, even in exile, Wilde's flamboyant spirit refused to be entirely subdued. Stories from this time speak of a man who, despite his failing health and diminished circumstances, maintained a sharp tongue and a penchant for theatricality. He could still deliver a withering quip or a perfectly timed joke, reminding the world, and perhaps himself, that the essence of Oscar Wilde was not so easily erased. His time in France also highlighted the deep contrast between his internal world and external reality. He was a man caught between who he had been, a celebrated wit and aesthete, and who he had become, a tragic exile bearing the scars of a scandal that had destroyed his career and reputation. This tension permeates his later writings and letters, where humor and despair often dance together in a bittersweet tango. Despite the melancholy, Wilde's exile was not just an end but also a form of reinvention, a quiet reclaiming of his identity away from the harsh glare of public opinion. Living under false names and away from the judgmental gaze allowed him a measure of peace, however fragile, to reflect on his life and art. In the end, this chapter of Wilde's life is a profound meditation on loss, resilience, and the cost of genius living too loudly in a world unready for it. It's a reminder that behind every legend is a deeply human story, filled with triumphs, heartbreaks, regrets, and moments of unexpected grace. Oscar Wilde's final days unfolded far from the glittering salons and raucous theatres that had once celebrated his flamboyance and razor-sharp wit. Instead, he spent them in a dingy Paris hotel room, a place so bleak and unpleasant that even his famously sharp tongue couldn't sugarcoat it. The Hotel d'Alsace, now known as Hotel Raspail, was the kind of place where good taste and comfort were clearly on vacation, permanently. Wilde himself described the wallpaper as the colour of a boiled lobster, a metaphor so vivid that it perfectly captures the ugliness he faced in his last chapter. If irony had a residence, this hotel room would be it. By the time Wilde checked into the Hotel d'Alsace in late 1900, he was a shadow of the man who had once dazzled audiences and adversaries alike. His health was rapidly failing. Syphilis, which had been a dark cloud over much of his post-prison life, had reached its terminal stage. The flamboyant poet and playwright who had once donned extravagant clothes and delivered biting epigrams now found himself confined to a small bed in a room that could have been a test case for how to make a human feel miserable. 101. Wilde's days were a mix of physical pain and mental sharpness. Despite the agony, his wit remained intact, a last flicker of the genius that had both elevated and doomed him. He was known to make sardonic remarks about his surroundings, refusing to let his spirit be entirely crushed by the bleakness. Friends who visited recalled how he would joke about the hideous decor or the dreadful food, turning every grim detail into a punchline. Even in suffering, Wilde was still the master of wit, proving that some talents are truly immortal. Financial ruin compounded his misery. Wilde had spent his final years under enormous debt, partly due to the legal battles that had stripped him of his fortune, and partly due to his lifestyle before his fall. At this point, champagne, the drink most associated with celebration, became a bittersweet companion. Stories from those final days tell of bottles shared in dimly lit rooms, the bubbles rising as if to mock the gravity of the situation. Wilde reportedly kept a bottle of champagne on hand, drinking it in small sips, clinging to whatever semblance of pleasure he could find in a life so drastically diminished. His famous last words, according to legend, were delivered with characteristic flair and a touch of dark humour. When asked if he wanted anything before he died, Wilde reportedly quipped, "Yes, wallpaper. One should have beautiful things around one." Whether apocryphal or true, the line perfectly encapsulates Wilde's obsession with beauty, even when surrounded by the very worst of it. The irony that he died, lamenting the room's ugly wallpaper, rather than any more profound final thought, is a cruel but fitting end for a man who lived his life as a brilliant, flamboyant dandy. The hotel room was filled with an odd mixture of decay and defiance. On one hand, it was a symbol of everything Wilde had lost: fame, fortune, and friends. On the other, it was the stage for his last act, a testament to his refusal to go quietly into the night. Even as his body failed, his mind remained a place of sharp observation and biting humour. This contrast between physical decline and intellectual vitality is what makes Wilde's death so tragically poetic. Wilde passed away on November 30th, 1900, at the age of 46, relatively young by today's standards, but after a life packed with excess, brilliance, scandal, and pain. His death went largely unnoticed by the wider public at the time, a sad coda to a man who had once been the centre of attention everywhere he went. Only a small group of friends and admirers were present at his funeral, held at the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, where he was buried in an unmarked grave until later memorials honoured his legacy. The irony of Wilde's death is hard to miss. A man who had devoted his life to beauty, art, and wit died surrounded by ugliness and hardship. Yet, even in this stark contrast lies a reflection of the man himself, one who never stopped valuing beauty, even if it was just in the wallpaper, and who faced the end with a champagne-soaked mix of sadness and humour. His passing was not the end of Oscar Wilde's story. Though the world largely turned away in his final years, the legend of Wilde would only grow stronger in death, fueled by the very qualities that had made him both beloved and reviled: his brilliance, his biting wit, and his unapologetic flair for living life on his own flamboyant terms. For years after his death, Wilde's work suffered under the weight of Victorian morality. His plays and writings were banned or quietly shelved, and the scandal that engulfed him cast a long shadow. The very society that once adored Wilde had turned its back, branding him a cautionary tale. But time, as it often does, proved the critics wrong. Slowly, Wilde's sharp wit and fearless exploration of human nature began to resurface in public consciousness. Scholars dusted off his plays, readers rediscovered the picture of Dorian Gray, and new generations found inspiration in his fearless embrace of identity and art. The 20th century marked the turning point for Wilde's posthumous fame. His writings, which once scandalized audiences with their wit and critique of societal hypocrisy, became celebrated for their literary genius and daring social commentary. The art for art's sake philosophy that Wilde championed was embraced by modernists, surrealists, and rebels alike, turning him into a poster child for artistic freedom. His plays, especially The Importance of Being Earnest, became staples of theatre repertoires worldwide, enjoyed by audiences who appreciated the elegant comedy and sly social jabs as much as his original fans did. Minus the Victorian prudery, Wilde's influence also extends deep into pop culture. His epigrams, those snappy, often paradoxical one-liners, have become part of the everyday lexicon. You've probably seen "Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken," or I can resist everything except temptation, floating around Instagram captions or meme pages, sometimes without even knowing they came from Wilde's pen. His words are quoted by comedians, politicians, celebrities, and anyone looking to add a little sharp humor to their speech. Wilde's ability to turn a phrase with razor precision means his wit remains eternally fresh and relevant. More than that, Wilde's style, his velvet suits, colourful waistcoats, and extravagant scarves, sparked a fashion revolution that continues to influence designers and performers. From David Bowie's glam rock persona to modern drag queens and fashion icons, Wilde's dandyism is celebrated as a symbol of creativity and fearless self-expression. He made being extra an art form long before it became a social media trend. In the classroom, Wilde's works are now studied not just for their literary value, but for their rich exploration of themes like identity, societal norms, and freedom. High school and university students grapple with the picture of Dorian Gray and the importance of being earnest, discovering Wilde's biting critique of hypocrisy and the cost of hiding one's true self. Teachers use his life story to open conversations about justice, human rights, and the power of art to challenge society. The very curriculum that once might have shunned Wilde now celebrates him as a timeless genius. Even in tattoo parlors around the world, Wilde's legacy lives on. His quotes and portraits are popular choices, inked as permanent reminders of wit, resilience, and the courage to live authentically. Wearing Wilde on one's skin is a badge of honor, and a homage to a man who dared to be himself in a world that demanded conformity. What makes Wilde's resurrection so remarkable is how his story blends tragedy and triumph, art and identity, humor and heartbreak. He was a man who faced society's harshest judgment and still managed to leave a legacy that defies time and prejudice. His life encourages us to challenge norms, cherish beauty, and wield humor like a sword. In a world that often still struggles with acceptance and freedom of expression, Oscar Wilde's resurrection is a reminder that sometimes being a little extra isn't just about style, it's about survival and revolution.